Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what cross him.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is Saturday, January 27th, 2024, and I just did like a 2.5 hour awesome speech / rant on the whole history of the Cold War and the connections between the CIA and Charismatics and Rushdoony's Reconstructionist movement and how all that turned into the NAR. And it was on point, but I forgot to hit record. So it was the greatest rant in the world. This is just a tribute, if you guys know that reference. But basically, I've been researching the part of my book that is on just the whole Cold War history, and it's been a lot of work to just unravel it all and to figure out, what story I tell first, what I document first. But I mean, it's a very convoluted time, but it's once you understand the Cold War mentality and basically the work of the CIA and what's going on as America's shifting essentially to basically a military industrial state, you really are laying a base for a future development of fascism. And it's just kind of in the nature of how business and politics and the intelligence community and the military industrial complex are all intersecting, and how that basically we essentially created it in Soviet Russia, and now we're having to create kind of like we're having to create it here in the United States, basically to counter what's developing in the Soviet Union, but we developed that. So where all this starts is essentially you really have to understand this whole tragedy and hope thing in Carroll Quigley's book, which is, again, this is Bill Clinton's mentor. This guy pretty much outs these roundtable groups, and it's an Anglo-American group who have been basically manipulating media and industry and finance, and it's less that it's like this unified conspiracy theory where these guys are creating these guys, and it's more like propping up and financing the rise of certain personalities and political movements and stuff like that are going to essentially generate really kind of more extremist views in a direction that are going to fit their overarching narrative, which is this Hegelian paradigm of a thesis, an antithesis, and then an eventual synthesis popping up. So these guys, obviously, this dialogue has been pretty open. It's not like this, there is no Illuminati after the 1700s or after the Napoleonic Wars, where it seems to just disappear and then the Jesuits come back. It seems like what the Illuminati that existed was probably guys who were mostly in the Jesuits and the Freemasons and Rosicrucians recruited by Jesuits, but Adam Weishaupt seems to be the figurehead of that. And then it was probably involved with the intrigues that led to the American and French revolutions, and then it kind of gets outed after the French revolutions, and that's when basically you have the anti-Masonic party in America, and Freemasonry go underground in America. You have Freemasonry outlawed in Europe, and the Illuminati just disappears as an organization, and then the Jesuits come back. So you probably had, again, there were probably some crossover interests between the Jesuits, but again, you're dealing with these secret societies that are advancing increasingly non-Christian, more atheistic, deistic, naturalistic, materialistic ideologies, which is basically just, a reemergence of the Greek ideologies that ruled before Christianity came into play. So just think Greco-Romanism without Christianity. That's essentially what is being advanced and espoused in the Freemason lodges. So don't think of it as as openly nefarious Satanism. I mean, there probably were elements of that in there, but it's mostly guys who are, thinking of themselves as scientific rationalists, getting away from religious superstition, which has been, causing wars in Europe, between Europe, England, and all these countries over Protestantism and Catholicism for 150 years. These guys are sick of all this stuff, and so they're going away from religion in general because they just think it's absurd by this point, and they're sick of just killing and witch hunts and stupid stuff that's been going on. So in that aftermath, you have the 18th century kind of, you don't really have secret societies being much of a thing what you have more is these philosophical groups and these think tanks and stuff like that, and then university fraternities, which, yes, there's going to be a little bit of clandestine cooperation in these groups, more so, but because the world is now not policing religion, it's really more just open, non theistic ideologies that are basically turning into goals to project that into the wider culture, and then basically project that into the governments and how they run things. And once you get into the U.S. government being based around ideas that come from John Locke, you really have kind of the ground for a naturalistic and eventually atheistic government system. And as America develops, it becomes, the universities and even the seminaries becoming increasingly secular. The universities and seminaries are going to become increasingly more like deistic. And so they're going to start adopting ideas like rejecting miracles and like theistic evolution and the old earth theory and stuff like that. And they're really just adopting deistic ideas that are going to lead them to effectively disbelieving the Bible while claiming to believe it. But they look at the Bible more allegorically. Again, this would have been more like how Augustine was, although Augustine would have been less so. He would have still looked at a lot of this history as allegory, guys like Origen and stuff like this. And so you're going to see obviously these Calvinistic and then these Origenistic ideas are going to come back in terms of all the textual criticism that's going to be in the seminaries. And so these guys are increasingly worldly in their outlook, and they basically just look at the gospel ideology as like center to kind of this idea of spiritual rebirth and right and wrong, but they don't really look at history and prophecy and miracles and stuff like that as true anymore. They look at it as like those are more like allegories and commentaries of what's going on cyclically throughout the world, and time doesn't have a mediated beginning and end with history and prophecy, clearly dictating we're going to have 7,000 years. They don't believe any of this. They look at it as just an ongoing thing with no, an indefinite end to this. And of course, postmillennialism very much feeds into that. And so when you get to the 20th century, you're going to have the seminaries really thinking in terms of postmillennial indefinite ideology, while the fundamentalists are going to be going to dispensational futurism. So it's mostly going to be pre-trib rapture, not all, but it's premillennial. They see the world as getting worse, and then we're getting to the end times. While your postmillennialists, which are going to be mostly your Calvinists, are going to see the world as like, no, this is just a cycle. We just go through, ups and downs, dark periods, peaks and valleys, and things like that. But eventually we're going to take over the world for Christ, okay? And you're going to have a split between ideologies, which are going to be your liberals. We're going to do that through charity and education and advances in medicine and science. Things like prohibition, abolition are going to come from that side. And then you're going to have the more Dominionist side, which is going to be like pro-slavery and basically they want libertarianism, because the more you have libertarianism, the guys who are basically smarter and more dominant are eventually going to take control of all the finances and industry and resources and dominate the world. And these guys are, think Puritans and think Geneva, Switzerland. That's why you've got all this banking and money lending coming out of there, coming out of the Dutch Republic, because these guys are looking at like winning the contest through basically seeing the rules basically set up to adopt free market libertarian policies. So they want to see less government intervention, while Calvinistic Christian interests basically take over the world economically. And with slavery and with war and things like that, and until eventually, basically, the gospel is being forcefully spread throughout the earth, while those who aren't going to submit to the gospel are going to be under the law of Moses. That's how they think. Okay, and this was very much alive in Switzerland. This is very much alive, not as much in the Dutch Republic, although they did persecute and in some cases kill, in some cases drive out people who weren't for Calvinism. Same thing with the Puritans. But this is going to crystallize as a real pure philosophy with this guy named R.J. Rushdoony in the 1960s. And For those of you who don't realize, R.J. Rushdoony is probably going to be the single most influential ideologue that's going to affect the Christian right in from about the 1960s to the present. You don't hear his name a lot unless you're traveling in Calvinistic circles, but like I found Jeff Durbin from Apologia Studios basically propping up his son 8 years ago, and basically whitewashing his ideology. Now, just so you understand how this guy was, Francis Schaeffer, who is a pretty well-reputed, I think he's Calvinist, but he is... he'd be considered like a moderate. He's a guy who's a deep thinker. He's a guy who's going to focus on, how are we getting Christianity to the culture? How are we evangelizing? Is it working? And he's going to have, he's going to be into this presuppositional apologetics, okay? Now, presuppositional apologetics is something that goes back to this guy, Cornelius Van Til, okay? And Cornelius Van Til is essentially, there's an essential truth to presuppositional apologists, but there's an overreach with Calvinism. So what's going to go on is presuppositional apologist is going to basically make some certain conclusions, and I'm going to simplify this for you. It's like this. Romans 1 talks about how people know there's a God and know there's a right and wrong. In other words, they show the law written on their heart because they're accusing... They're basically accusing or justifying one another, okay? So the fact that even if you're a liberal atheist, you still make moral judgments on whether or not another person is good or evil shows that you understand that there is a right and wrong that comes from a source that is bigger than yourself, okay? You're implicitly admitting that there's a God, because how can you say there's a right and wrong and a good and evil, instinctively? You instinctively do it. You instinctively think it's wrong to be stolen from. And of course, the simple argument of Romans 1 is that you don't like it when it's done to you, so you know it's wrong. That's how you know it's wrong. And so treat others the way you want to be treated. It's really simple. But God is saying, like, well, that's hardwired into you. Well, I'm sorry. The Calvinists are going to say that's hardwired into you to know that. What Romans 1 is really saying is you learn that through life. And so God is telling you how you see his eternal power and divine attributes through the things that are made. And what he's really saying is you enter into this world in a kind of trinity. You have your mother, your father, and yourself. There's a kind of trinity there. Okay? And there's a way that they interact with each other and how, you're all kind of a unit, and yet and you're supposed to be walking in unity. You shouldn't have warfare in your household. And yet there's a head, there's a father, and then he has a helper, and the helper leads the child till the child gets to a certain point, and then that child becomes to become like a wife, a future wife, or a helper, or a future husband, which is a future father. Okay. Well, this is he's saying through what God has made, he is teaching you just naturally through life, because he designed the things that are made, to eventually come to understand the Trinity. Okay, and again, you've heard me get on the case of the term Trinity. Yes, it comes from Pythagorean Gnosticism, but the idea of the Father, Spirit, and Son as three that operate as a single unit is replete throughout Scriptures, and it's the primary example, the primary type of that is meant to be the human family unit, which is why the devil's always attacking the human family unit. And as far as learning right and wrong, or the law imprinted on your heart. He's not saying that you're born with this implicit knowledge of right and wrong, because you're not. Otherwise, little babies wouldn't, go around and grab each other's stuff and get mad and all this other stuff. They do what they do because they don't know, but they have a sense of, getting offended. And what they're saying is basically what you have written on your heart is you don't like when somebody steals from you. You don't like when somebody hurts you. You don't like when somebody takes what's yours. You don't like when somebody doesn't treat you the way they'd want to be treated. And it's basically that sense of that sensitivity to injustice that is placed on the heart of every man. Okay, and so that's how the law is written in your heart. The actual 10 Commandments and how that breaks down into a set of rules that basically is meant to show that we all fall short of keeping that standard, is there to educate us, to bring us to Christ, to show us that the reason we don't keep the standard is because we're fallen and we're in bondage to sin through the fear of death. once we're set free from the fear of death, we don't worry about getting what's our brother's because we're going to have eternal life. We're eventually going to get everything we want. Okay? If we just are patient and wait for it. So, Francis Schaeffer and Rushdoony are both into this presuppositional apologetics, and that's going to be where they intersect, okay? But Francis Schaeffer is going to meet Rushdoony and his followers, and I want to say it's in the 80s that they meet him. And he is going to walk away from that and say basically that him and his followers creep him out. He compares them to Jonestown, which is where the Jim Jones cult is, or to the Koresh compound, or to he calls a madrasa in Pakistan. So basically the Taliban. Okay, so he's literally comparing Francis Schaeffer and his followers. He's saying, talking to them in the way they, like almost worship his thoughts is like you're around like the Taliban or a cult. Okay, well, Schaeffer, again, he is going to work with the China Inland Mission, with Hudson Taylor. He's going to be involved in Calvinist circles, Presbyterian, that's Westminster Theological Seminary, and J. Gresham Machen is, I believe, he's basically part of the kind of like the first generation of the group that breaks away from Princeton when Princeton goes liberal. So he's Presbyterian. They still believe in infant baptism. They're still Calvinistic, but they're not getting into all the liberal Calvinistic stuff. Meanwhile, the liberal ones are going to be where the CIA comes out of. So it's going to be Yale and Princeton guys. These are basically Presbyterians and Puritan background people, so Congregationalists, that are very much, they kind of view themselves as an American aristocracy. Like a lot of these people can trace their roots back to rich founding members of the American Republic or very early people, and the Presbyterians obviously, and the Congregationalist Puritans. There were some of the first established groups here with universities and stuff like that, and so they were very dominant in the Northeast. And when you get into, a lot of these guys are going to be military families too. You're going to have people who are going to become officers. Well, basically in World War I, World War II, you're going to have basically develop in World War II the OSS, which is the basically the spies that served during World War II under the Navy. And then at the end of World War II, because we just basically hand all of Eastern Europe to Russia, now we have this Cold War. We have this Iron Curtain, and this is definitely a manufactured thing. We didn't have to give Russia all these Eastern Bloc countries, but we did. And of course, they're setting up puppet governments in them, and they're basically pillaging them to feed Moscow, which is essentially to create this communist engine, which is going to develop all these nukes, and it's going to develop this war machine that's going to, basically set up spies and ship weapons and do all this stuff all over the world to advance global communism. And, we largely empowered that both during and after World War II. Well, meanwhile, as a response to that, everything we're doing in the Cold War is justified by what Russia's doing. So Russia's taking in a bunch of Nazi scientists after World War II, so we're going to take in a bunch of Nazi scientists after World War II. And Operation Paperclip takes in like 1,600 Nazi scientists, and these guys are going to kind of filter into America, into the military-industrial complex, into the aerospace industry, into NASA and the space program, because this is all stuff that all this experimentation the Nazis are doing on the Jews and stuff like that. They're not just torturing them for the fun of torturing them. They're doing stuff to try to figure out what it takes for air travel and space travel at a high level, and all the stuff that's going to turn into jet propulsion technology and that kind of flight, and then space travel and all that stuff comes from the research the Nazis do. They also are going to do a lot of psychological research that's going to be based on propaganda and essentially mind control of their populations. That's a big thing they're into. They're also going to be mixing in occult with essentially materialistic sciences. So the paranormal research they're going to be doing, okay? And all this stuff is going to come into the CIA. It's going to come into NASA, and a lot of it is going to come into the business world. Okay, because a lot of this stuff is Also, things having to do with economic theories, things having to do with management theory, stuff like that, because it's all based on this psychological research of how you get people to do what you want. Okay, well, this is one thing that gets justified, and it's going to metastasize into a bunch of problems in America and stuff having to do with the military-industrial complex, that we're still reaping the problems from that. Well, another thing that's going to come is the creation of a permanent intelligence agency, the CIA, and then another thing that's going to come in is the upholding of a permanent large-scale weapons industry. Well, if you have a large-scale weapons industry, you need to keep launching wars. You need to test these weapons. You need to test these new battle tactics and stuff like this. And this is something that I believe it's... you're going to have Eisenhower in 1961 in his farewell address. Remember, you're going to have... let's see, is it... So you're going to have basically Truman follow Roosevelt for after the World War I, and then you're going to have Eisenhower follow him. And when Eisenhower gets out in 1961, he's going to be followed by Kennedy. Well, Eisenhower is going to warn of the growing power. In his farewell address, he's going to warn of the growing power of this military-industrial complex. And he's going to tell you this thing is becoming a monster, and that it could take over America, and it has. Okay? Now, so... he's saying this. Remember, we're already starting to get involved in Vietnam. There's conflicts there. Basically, essentially the Japanese take it over from the French, and then you're going to have people who rise up, just like in North Korea and China and all this stuff. You're going to have people who are fighting against the Japanese, and we're going to be supportive of those people. And then when the Japanese get kicked out, when they lose World War II, the French are just going to go back in there and say, okay, this is ours again. And this kind of stuff's happening all over the world in World War II. You have all these colonial powers that are basically like, these indigenous people are fighting against these oppressive, whether it's the Nazis or the Italians or the Japanese, and then we're supposed to just go back under subjugation to European colonial powers after we're done, when we've been fighting and we're organized now. And that's where you get a lot of the Cold War politics from. You basically have Russia saying, hey, how about we arm you guys and you can have your own government? And by the way, why don't you just nationalize your resources and actually use that to fund your government, instead of just giving all your resources to these Englishmen and these Frenchmen and stuff like that, who basically just came in and claimed your countries in the 1800s. And they like this idea. This is not a communist plot. This is just people saying, hey, why should we honor the ownership claims of these different, English and European and American people who basically came in here and said that diamond mine is, okay, well, we won't subjugate you as part of our colonial empire anymore, but the diamond mine is still ours. The tin mine is still ours. The rubber manufacturing is still ours. And nationalizing of resources is stuff like countries routinely do this. They have no problem doing this, okay? The idea of, taking a large-scale national resource, and, Saudi Arabia does this. This is how their government's funded. We don't call them communists, okay? The idea of just taking a national resource, or a large-scale resource, and using it for the benefit of the whole country socialistically, we don't have a problem with it at all if it's our allies doing it. But if we, again, remember, these people who are... in the CIA and who are in the MI6 and who are in the establishment of the government in the early years, they are people who come from rich families who that stuff belonged to them, okay? So it's like we overthrow Guatemala because the Duels brothers are invested in Dole bananas. And we want the control of the bananas that come out of Guatemala. We want to keep having cheap bananas so these guys can make money off bananas. We're going to do this with sugar. We're going to do this with rubber. We're going to do this with, and that's why we go into Afghanistan. There's a ton of lithium there, okay? All this stuff is about resources and about, making claims to stuff in other people's countries. And, we're going to go back and forth, whether it's our allies or not. And if it's going to be in our strategic interests, we're going to use the boogeyman of communism to basically say, oh man, this is a communist plot to take this over, when a country basically is just like, no, we're going to nationalize that resource, which basically means here's some money for your diamond mines, but get the F out of our country. Okay, you don't own our gold mines or our diamond mines just because you guys claimed it in the name of Jesus 200 years ago. Okay, And basically, what you're going to have is communism is essentially providing a certain level of arms and intelligence and governmental organization and military training to back up a desire to kick out colonial powers and nationalize those resources and fund a government and just be a free people. That's what most of this is based on, is just freedom from colonialism. Well, there's nothing illegitimate about that. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have created the specter of communism so we can point at it and say that's communism spreading. And then it becomes an excuse to go send in our CIA, send in our military, train up factions, basically divide, arm up another side, and then stirs up conflict in the world. And what you end up having is you have all these countries, and I mean South America, I mean Africa, I mean Southeast Asia, all these countries who barely had guns before World War II, are now all running around with AKs. Loaded with people running around with AKs, fighting in internal civil wars that are going to be largely backed by the U.S. and their allies, or Russia and their allies. And we're dividing the whole world over this communist thing. We're causing tons and tons of death. And it's all about basically unifying the world in one of these two camps, which are eventually going to be merged towards a one world government. We'll get into that in a later episode and show how that pulls into 9/11. But I'm focusing more on the church now and how it's affecting the church. Okay, so R.J. Rushdoony, I want you to think about the atmosphere this guy grows up in. Okay, R.J. Rushdoony comes from a family of Armenians who fled in 1915 from the Armenian genocide that was being carried out by the Turks. Now remember, the Turks, Armenia was Orthodox, okay? And basically the Turks overthrow the Ottoman Empire in the end of the 15th century, and basically Turkey ends up having control of the seat of power of the Greek Orthodox Empire, if you will. And basically, you're going to have all kinds of stuff going on between Turkey being broken up, the Ottoman Empire being broken up in World War I. After that, Turkey is basically the Ottoman Empire is going to be broken up by European powers, and they're going to give a big chunk of Armenia or a big chunk of Turkey, what is now Turkey, to Armenia, and say, here, you're going to have a big Armenian kingdom now. And Turkey's going to be like, heck to the no, because their power base is in what's now Turkey. And they're going to basically take most of that back. They're going to keep fighting and take most of that back. And that's how you get, there's a lot you need to learn about that, but that's how you get Turkey from the modern civil war. Well, part of taking that back is pushing out Armenians, and they ethnic cleanse Armenians. There's a genocide against Armenians. And what ends up happening is that, a lot of these Armenians are going to flee and go to places like Europe and America. Well, Rushdoony is one of those families, okay? So I want you to have this in your head for Rushdoony. Rushdoony has kind of a reason to hate Turkey, okay? And he would love to see Christendom united and take back the seat of Ottoman Empire and get revenge against the Turks and get Armenia free again, make Armenia great again, okay? This is what's in his heart from childhood, okay? So Rushdoony comes to America and he basically becomes a Presbyterian. The Presbyterians are probably the most they descend from Scottish Highlanders, okay, and so they're probably among the more militant thinking of the Protestants, okay, and so you're going to find them, and obviously the Puritans are going to be more like internal minded thinking like that, but the Presbyterians are going to be more external minded thinking of that. And you're going to find Puritans and Presbyterians very, very, the Puritans largely dissipate. And so the Presbyterians are going to be the main people who are going to advance the Calvinist Dominionist thinking on the side of, power and dominion, okay? A lot of the Puritans are going to become Unitarians. A lot of them are going to get into New Age. A lot of them are going to become, atheists and just all kinds of weird stuff. A lot of them are going to become Swedenborgians. You're just not going to have a strong Puritan base anymore. It's going to dissipate after after the American Revolution. But the Presbyterians keep morphing and growing, and they split and merge back together. They split over the evangelical born again experience, and then they merge back together. They split over the Civil War and slavery. They merge back together, and then they're going to split over basically liberalism and conservatism, and they're kind of merging back together. Okay. What you end up with is, remember, the Presbyterians are going to largely lose their influence once everyone starts getting into dispensationalism and fundamentalism, because almost all your evangelical fundamentalists believe in believers' baptism, which the Presbyterians don't, and they believe in dispensationalism, which a lot of the Presbyterians don't. They're still post-millennial, essentially amillennial Calvinists, right? And so a lot of the Presbyterians that come out during these different movements leave Presbyterianism altogether. They leave Calvinism altogether and become like the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. That's the Stone Campbell movement. And then they're going to become like the Bible churches that come out of like Dallas Theological Seminary. But a lot of them are going to become dispensationalists, believe in believers' baptism. And then the Stone Campbell movement is going to be amillennial, but not so much post-millennial. So they're not looking at, advancing, the kingdom. Basically, they get involved in missions. They get involved in basically spreading Bible teaching and missions for the most part. Okay. So Rushdoony is basically going to become, at first he becomes a liberal Presbyterian. Okay. He is going to switch to become a more conservative Presbyterian. But as he's a liberal Presbyterian, remember, the guys who are the liberal Presbyterians, this is Princeton, or liberal Calvinists, are going to be, the same guys from the schools that have the fraternities that they recruit for the CIA from. Okay, and these guys are going to be with moneyed interests. And from the time you have the Cold War, you're going to have a growing movement towards libertarianism. The reason is this. From basically around World War I, you really have, not Franklin Roosevelt, but so Woodrow Wilson and these guys, you have Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson, and he's going to, want to do the League of Nations, but he can't get everyone on board. That after him, you're going to have people pushing prohibition, and that is a kind of a dominionist post-millennial thing, and that's going to go for a while. And of course, we're going to create all kinds of mafias around the liquor trade and stuff like that, and that turns into a mess. And then you're going to get Franklin D. Roosevelt, and we're going to have World War II break out. And he is going to serve 4 terms. So you're going to have a Democrat serving 4 terms, and then he's going to push his New Deal, which is largely socialistic. There's a ton of welfare. There's a ton of changes that are going to come through and related to the education system, and related to welfare programs, and related to things like the GI Bill and all that stuff's going to come through. But he's going to rule for 4 terms, and that's where they put the rule after that to say, okay, you can only have 2 terms as president. It's looking like this guy, he's not necessarily going to be able to become a dictator. He's going to die in office. But a lot of things change in America, okay? And then you're going to have Truman after him, another Democrat, Eisenhower after him, another Democrat. I think Eisenhower's a Democrat. I'm sorry, Eisenhower was a Republican. I apologize. So, and then you're going to go back to Kennedy, another Democrat, and Lyndon Johnson, another Democrat. So the Democrats have largely dominated, basically the presidency from really before World War I into like the 1960s. And you're going to have an advancement of basically a lot of socialistic policies, plus you're going to have an advancement of civil rights, which a lot of racist Southerners don't like. Plus, you're going to have the Vietnam War, which is unpopular on both sides of the aisle. A lot of conservatives are going to be for the Vietnam War because it's sold to them as we need to stop communism in Vietnam. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting it basically in Mexico. That's really how they're selling it. Like, we're going to be, if we don't basically go fight communism like we do in North Korea, the Korean War, right? If we don't send troops to basically advise and go help people build up their military forces to stop communism, then it's going to eventually be on our borders, and we're going to have to be fighting communism here. Okay, mind you, communism was always propped up by the West. Lenin was sent to Russia with a trainload of gold from Western interests to basically overthrow the Russian Empire, and part of that was going to be basically, once they do, is pulling Russia out of World War I. So it's like literally like German and interests like that German and Swiss interests that are basically going to collude to send them to Russia. And of course, once they do that, they're out of World War One, and now Germany doesn't have to fight on that front anymore. That's very convenient for them, right? And then what you're going to have is it's going to be the socialism in Germany that is going to lead to people turning the other way as the fascist Nazis rise to power, because they're making Germany great again, and they are getting rid of these stupid fascists who are basically always doing terrorist attacks and stirring up crap, stirring up social crap. And it's like Antifa and Black Lives Matter. It's like those are communist groups. And people don't like it because they're going to use riots and burning and looting and stuff like that as a means of, trying to say, hey, we want the world order to shift because we want to share all your wealth that you earned, basically. And nobody likes that. So you're going to have interest in the West then fuel Hitler's rise to power, including the Bush family. Prescott Bush is definitely doing that. And then from there, once Hitler's a big threat, they're going to arm up Germany to fight Hitler. And they're also going to fuel the rise of the Japanese Empire. And then once they're there, they're going to fuel Russia to fight them. America's always doing this. Their financial interests, if you follow the money, you're going to find out that fueling both sides of a conflict and then getting the American people to enter in on the side where we've got the most money invested keeps happening. It keeps happening. Well, once you get to the Cold War, it starts to become systematic. We need to send 60,000 American troops to die and kill millions in Vietnam in order to what's going on there? Like, why do we have to stop communism there? Well, there's rubber and tin there, and we don't really have a big. Remember, the automobile industry is blowing up. Okay, and we don't really have a good alternative to rubber tires yet, like real rubber that comes from rubber trees. Okay. But meanwhile, we're going to let Pol Pot kill a third of all of Cambodia, which is right next door, and we're not going to do anything about that. It's that kind of stuff that goes on. Why? There's nothing in Cambodia we want. We don't need more rice, right? And so you're going to see these kind of things, and they're always able to sell it to the American people as it's about communism when it's really about resources. And it's also about the military-industrial complex, because you're going to have like Lyndon Johnson's wife basically heavily invested in the companies that make the Huey helicopters that are going to be flying all over Vietnam. Okay, so you're going to find a combination of corruption and just direct influence between basically your lawmakers and your intelligence community and big industrial interests. Well, you're going to have a side of this that gets into the grassroots and eventually gets into the church, and it's going to start with the John Birch Society. Okay. So John Birch was basically he's not part of the John Birch Society. It's named after him, but John Birch is basically this guy who was a missionary. This is important. This is how they start intersecting it into the church. Okay, John Birch was a missionary who I believe he was Presbyterian, but he was working for an independent Baptist missionary, and he eventually became a spy. He became a spy for military intelligence during World War II in China. Okay, so he starts out as a missionary for an independent Baptist missionary in China, and then at the end of the war, he is basically sent to go accept the surrender of Japanese forces in the war, because they're not letting the Chinese. That you don't really have a definite Chinese government. You have the Chinese Republican government, but we're working with the Chinese Communists too against Japan, and it's not really clear who the government is, but basically the U.S. is only letting U.S. agents accept the surrender from Japanese forces. And so they send this guy up to accept the Japanese surrender, and he gets into an altercation with the Chinese, and he ends up getting killed by Chinese communists, okay? Well, the John Birch Society is going to be started by this guy, Robert Welch, who is going to turn that into propaganda to basically say he was the first casualty of the Cold War, okay? Remember, the Cold War is a made-up thing. It's a made-up thing that you have basically these guys create on purpose right after World War II, because you literally have guys like Patton saying, "Hey, we've got a good army organized here. Let's go straight to Moscow. We know we know we're totally propping up their arms industry, so to fight Germany, now just stop doing it and let's take Moscow because we need to get these communists out. They're the bigger threat. And of course, Patton mysteriously dies in a car accident not long after that. Okay, we know like MacArthur, who's over the naval forces in the West. He basically is saying, let's nuke the border of North Korea so the Chinese can't come through. Just drop a bunch of nukes on the border so it's all radioactive and just take North Korea. Somehow he gets, I don't know what happens to him. He doesn't die, but he doesn't get hurt. And so we have this conflict in North Korea and South Korea that has existed ever since. Well, the reason is because both sides want a buffer between essentially U.S. interests in South Korea and Japan and Chinese interests, and North Korea is that perfect buffer. You have these people who are awfully miserable, but it's a buffer between them. Okay, the U.S. isn't trying to get into a direct conflict with China. There's a million of them, and it would be very hard. Okay, but they do want a strong. I mean, they really pull out from supporting the government in China until it backs into Taiwan, and they want the same kind of thing. Well, we've got Taiwan is essentially like a South Korea and China, okay? And essentially we would say that that's the legitimate government of China. And what we're doing is the British have Hong Kong, we have all these beachheads in China that were always there, and they were always economic interests, but it's an excuse to say, well, we need to have these potential counterpunches to communism because communism is taking over China. Well, yeah, we let them do that, okay? We totally helped them do that, okay? Or we basically didn't do what it took to stop them from doing that, okay? We want the big boogeyman of communism there so that we can basically execute our interests all across the world in the name of the big bad boogeyman of communism, okay? And so you're going to have that mostly in Russia and China. And meanwhile, you're going to have guys like Robert Welch, and he is a retired confectionery, and he seems to be a little wacky. There's always the possibility that this guy is doing this for alternative motives from the beginning, but he really just seems to be a pretty wacky, libertarian-minded, big American patriot, Christian. He's an independent Baptist who is propping up, the big bad boogeyman of communism, along with a lot of conspiracy theories. And this JBS society is they're still around today. Alex Jones is from the JBS, okay? Just so you know, your right-wing conspiracy theory wacky guys, this stream turns into Alex Jones and that crowd, okay? And so this is going to start in really the late 50s, and these guys are going to feel a number of conspiracies, including Jesuit conspiracies, Illuminati conspiracies, New World Order conspiracies. He's not going to bash the Freemasons, though. He's going to prop up the Freemasons as good patriotic groups, while the Illuminati were the bad guys, and basically make it sound like the Freemasons were good, but the Illuminati gave us communism, which is bullcrap. Absolutely, Freemasonry gave us both. Basically, you're going to see Freemasonry become popular again among independent Baptists. That's largely who's going to, among Christians, I'm going to say the main ones joining the Freemasons are going to be independent Baptists, okay? It used to be the main ones were Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Now it's independent Baptists, okay? And so Robert Welch is basically going to keep this organization going, and they're going to have people who are involved with it, like guys like, let's see. Well, I'm sorry. They're going to actually start attacking people who are Democrats, and they're going to start attacking people who don't run their policies the way they want, even when it's reasonable. And like one of the things he famously does is he calls Eisenhower, who is he is a Republican. They're going to call him a communist. Okay, these guys are going to largely fuel the communist witch hunts. And so Eisenhower is gonna they're gonna accuse Eisenhower. They're gonna get kind of pushed to the fringe in Congress and stuff like that. Like, these guys are crazy, and basically they're going to be largely part of the fuel that becomes the communist witch hunts and stuff like that. Okay, now you do have people in America who are pro-socialist. Okay, you always have, because socialism has been around since the early to mid 1800s, and the ideas of creating greater social programs as kind of like a safety net from the poorest of society. Remember, we have poor immigrants and ex-slaves all over the country. We don't just want to be like, yeah, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but here's a 5 cents an hour job. Good luck. While these other people are super rich, and meanwhile these people were slaves for all these years, or poor immigrants are working for dirt poor wages forever. Okay, we want to have a safety net for the lowest at the bottom, and that had mostly been carried out by church charities. But eventually we got to systematize this thing, because you can't just expect the church charities to be doing all the giving. Meanwhile, the rich are getting super rich and people just don't want to give. Well, that's their problem. And these are people who basically stole land from Native Americans. They enslaved people. They just happened to be here first when the colonial powers basically just said, this is ours now. And then, some of these people were part of the families who just took it from England in the Revolutionary War. It's like you never had a fair starting point. And so the idea of having a socialistic safety net to make sure people are, always maintained above a certain level of like starvation or whatever is not wrong at all. There's nothing immoral about that. But these guys are going to push the idea of systematic, any kind of welfare and social programs are bad. They're immoral, basically. Any kind of collective bargaining, so think about like unions, are immoral. They're all part of a communist plot. Any kind of civil rights is immoral. So we don't like, that these people are allowed to do sit-ins and stand-ins and stuff like that when they're allowed to, buy food and pay for bus tickets the same price as everybody else, but you can't use the bathroom or sit at the counter. Like, you pay the same prices as the white people, but we still treat you like garbage. And we don't like the government stepping in to tell people, hey, you can't like make these people pay the same prices for stuff and then treat them like garbage, like animals in your stores and stuff like that. That's not okay. Well, that was always the government's priority, and they always had the right to do that. It's called a public trust. All businesses that have a charter is basically a license from the government, a public trust to serve the greater good of the public interest. And so they're doing it. All businesses and even charitable corporations exist in America if they have a 501c3 or if they have a business license. It exists under the authority of the government to say this is for the greater good. Well, it's not for the greater good when you're fomenting racial hatred. That's going to be a permanent institution in parts, and you're using your businesses and your churches to do it. That's not okay. Well, they basically push this stuff in the universities, and the last holdout from civil rights is the churches. So your independent Baptists and your Southern Baptists largely are going to be the ones who continue to be racist. You're going to have the Assemblies of God are going to be racist, and they're not going to allow any black clergy or anything like that, any blacks in the staff until like the 1960s. Okay, most people don't realize how racist America was among Christians. Okay, and they had largely sucked up stuff that was circulating around the KKK and a lot of this stuff about eugenics. Okay, a lot of this stuff is coming from Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons, which traces all the evil, corrupt pagan religions that became the Roman Catholic Church to Nimrod, who would have been an African because he's the son of Cush. Okay, it's not true. This is all myth. This is all myth and speculation. It's not true. Okay, his theory is not true. Okay, but he is going to trace all the religions to this big bad black guy, right? And so you're going to have that circulating around. You're going to have the serpent seed doctrine, which is going to go around the KKK, and then it's going to get into basically the charismatic movement through William Branham. Okay, and that's a racist movement. You're going to have a similar kind of movement circulating around the Mormons that are going to have, basically the red man and the black man is like a sign of their being wicked and kind of thing. Okay. Almost like the mark of Cain is dark skin type stuff. Okay, you're gonna have a number of different theories that are like this, but they're circulating largely among charismatics and independent Baptists because they're the least educated of the evangelicals. Okay, so the John Birch Society is going to capitalize on this. And when you start looking at membership in the John Birch Society, you're going to find that these are not all Christians. You have Christians in them, but you're going to find basically private industrial interests. You're going to find overlap with people who are connected to things like the CIA and right-wing libertarian politicians. Okay, and the common interest they all have is money. Okay, that's what they have. That's what's behind libertarianism. Remember, libertarianism is sold to the American people as keeping the government out of, telling you what to teach your kids, and keeping the government out of, taxing too much of your money and all that stuff. But a major feature of libertarianism is no taxation on land. Now, your average landowner says no taxation on land sounds really good. It sounds really good until you understand that there are banking interests and there are industrial interests that could buy up all the land, and then we all become serfs because they don't have to sell it to anyone, and it's not being taxed. So you can't even take from that land. They don't have to do anything with it. This is what a bad idea, no taxation on land, is. These guys can just buy up all the land and not do anything with it. They don't have to create towns on it. They don't have to create jobs on it. They just hold it to make sure nobody else can farm and compete with them. And if the government can't tax that, well, then the government can't make them essentially pay rent to do something with that land, which is going to turn into things like public schools so that other people can get ahead. These things are here to balance the equation so certain people who have advantages can't just buy up everything and turn everybody into their slaves, okay? Remember, all businesses exist as a public trust. Nobody has an inherent right to take over the country just because they're smart at economics, okay? It's a nation of people first, with a land, and the land, if the land belongs inherently to anyone, it belonged to the Native Americans, okay? But we took it from them, so we can't just be like, well, these people. You got to remember, a lot of these people got free land from the government back in the day, or they claimed, ancestral holdings that go back to the colonial powers, which these guys took from England. Or they took Florida from Spain, or they took half of the western United States from Mexico. Like, they took the land and then they gave it away to certain people. And you don't just have an opportunity to just say, well, these people got, ended up with all of it fair and square, and everybody else, sorry, we don't have any welfare and we can't tax the land and there's nothing we can do about it. They just rule everything like a new aristocracy. We don't want that, okay? Well, these guys are going to turn everything that's against their financial interests into part of the boogeyman, the communist boogeyman, okay? And so you're going to find these guys are propping up the Freemasons, which is going to have, you're going to have a lot of overlap with the Freemasons and the KKK, because the Freemasons are like a KKK. Or I'm sorry, the KKK is like a Freemason club. Okay, it's basically a regenerated Freemason club based around racism, based around the bitterness of the loss of the Civil War. Okay, and so these guys are going to prop that up, and then they're going to prop up King James onlyism. Now, King James onlyism, you find out the real origin of King James onlyism is a Seventh-day Adventist. Okay, a Seventh-day Adventist comes up with King James onlyism, and he basically has a number of theories that are reasonable, but his bigger overarching theory is like it was just a Jesuit conspiracy to destroy all faith in the Bible through these bad modern Bible translations that basically they're corrupting your Bible so they can eventually suck you back into the Catholic Church. Basically, they're going to try to destroy all faith in the Bible so that once you've lost faith in the Bible, then you can focus on Christian tradition, which, the Catholic Church is claiming the oldest Christian tradition, and it will suck everyone back in the Catholic Church. It's not true. It's just speculation, but he's going to tie the Anglican Oxford movement into a Jesuit plot, and of course a lot of those guys are involved with the textual criticism that's going to create these new translations. Now, there are legitimate concerns with the new textual criticism. We know they were heavily biased towards the Textus Vaticanus and the Textus Sinaiticus, and they basically are relying on assumptions of how they were created to assume that they're the oldest and best, okay? They're the oldest. Well, they're not the oldest, and they're not the best, okay? And we know that because we have a lot more older manuscripts that were around before them that were circulating around that can contain stuff that's in the Textus Receptus readings. So there is some truth to what this guy's saying, but he's also trying to prop up the King James because there's things in the King James that are errors that Seventh-day Adventism is built on. The main thing is the 2300 mornings and evenings, okay? So when you get to Daniel, I think it's Daniel 8, you're going to have this prophecy about 2300 mornings and evenings, okay? That's what it says. And they're going to take, because the King James just says days instead of mornings and evenings, they're going to say a day represents a year and say there's 2,300 years, and that takes us to 1844, and that's when Christ is ruling in the heavens, and that's also, when the Seventh-day Adventists start to form, okay? And it's basically a cult to Ellen G. White based around this false prophecy she has about Jesus basically entering into the Holy of Holies and starting to judge, this is important, starting to judge between the righteous and the wicked, from heaven, okay, and that includes true and false Christians. And so this is where you first have this idea of this imaginary, basically judgment between true and false Christians that's going on in the heavenly realms. Okay, it comes from the SDA. You're going to have something similar in the Jehovah's Witnesses, which they're going to claim that Jesus comes back in 1914, and when he doesn't, they're going to say he did spiritually, and then they're going to make their claims about the 144,000 who become essentially resurrected, and the rest do soul sleep or some stuff like that, and basically that's how they're gonna use it to try to make everybody try to become one of the elite 144,000 and the JWs and maintain their cult. Okay, so you're gonna have these creepy ideas going around, but a lot of them are based on poor translations in the King James. You're going to have a lot of ideas circulating in the 1800s that are based on poor structuring in the King James. Like, we don't need every line to start with a capital letter to make it sound like a new sentence when the last the last thing in the last line was a comma or a semicolon. It is very confusing to sit here and every sentence begins with the word and it just looks like it's a bunch of proverbial statements rather than it's like this is actually one big complex sentence. And the King James is confusing, okay? And so you have a lot of bad doctrines that are popping up around this. You have a lot of cults that have come and gone. There's a lot of sects and denominations that have come and gone in the 1800s. And the reason is because they're all using the King James. And King James just doesn't read like normal speech. It's meant to be like Shakespearean speech, but how many of you can sit through a movie where they're talking in Shakespearean speech and know what the frick they're talking about? It's really hard to flow with, and it's just your average reader. It's not helping the grassroots of Christianity become more educated. What you do is you have people who read it, and then you have these guys who are just making these very confident statements about stuff, and they're oftentimes not true. I've lived under a lot of this. Okay, now what they're going to do is this Seventh-day Adventist guy basically comes up with all the King James only theories. Okay. But no Baptist is going to accept a King James only theory that comes from Seventh-day Adventists, because the Seventh-day Adventists are a well-known cult to Ellen G. White. Okay, so what happens is basically you have a Baptist guy, and his name is J.J. Ray. In the 1960s, J.J. Ray, I'm never going to be able to find him, is going to completely plagiarize this other guy's, I'm trying to think of the guy's name. The Seventh-day Adventist guy's name is Benjamin Wilkinson, and I've read big chunks of his book. And Benjamin Wilkinson is going to come up with a theory in the 1930s, and in the 1960s, this guy J.J. Ray is going to completely plagiarize it, and he's going to write this book called God Wrote Only One Bible. He is basically writing this in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it's going to spread around among the Baptists. Then Peter Ruckman is going to pick it up, and then Jack Chick is going to pick it up. Those are going to be your main three guys who are propagating the King James only theory. Okay, Peter Ruckman kind of starts like a culty group to around his big personality, and he's going to be very conspiratorial, talk about Jesuit plots, very right-wing anti-communist. He's racist. And he's also a hyper-dispensationalist. So he's going to really push the idea that you don't need to be baptized. Okay? Do you think that guy's going to be popular on his own? Not on his own, no. Okay, but then J.J. Ray is going to be a little bit more mainstream among the Baptists, but he's a plagiarist. He's completely plagiarizing the book of a Seventh-day Adventist as his own, okay? And then the third guy is going to be Jack Chick. And Jack Chick comes up with Chick Publications. Now, Jack Chick is going to be a guy who comes up with all these gospel tracts, and a lot of them, like This Was Your Life is a famous one, but they're going to be, he's a comic book artist, and he's going to come up with all these tracts that they're going to spread, use to spread the gospel with. So if you see people who go around giving tracts away that have the gospel in them, that started with Jack Chick, okay? And he's going to write a lot of very popular ones. You can still buy them, and he's going to prop up two conspiracy theory frauds. One is going to be John Todd, and then another one is going to be, what is his name? The other one is going to be Alberto Rivera, okay? Both of these guys are frauds. John Todd is going to claim to be an ex-witch. He's not an ex-witch. He's a witch, period, okay? And John Todd is going to pop up among the Jesus culture movement. And Jack Chick is going to publish his story as if it's a true story about this guy who came out of witchcraft and all these conspiracies about what this group of witches called the Illuminati are basically doing and controlling America. And it's going to align with the communist boogeyman. It's also going to align with like King James onlyism, and it's going to align with all the anti-Catholic propaganda, okay? The other guy is, it's going to be anti-UN too, okay? And then the other guy is going to be Alberto Rivera, okay? Alberto Rivera is a false ex-Catholic, okay? He is actually, he's going to claim to be a Jesuit before becoming a Protestant. He was never a Jesuit. This is actually going to be, eventually going to be exposed. Everything he claims, his sister was a nun, he was sent to this mental hospital and all this stuff, is not true. This guy is actually... has a history of fraud and writing bad checks. He's just a serial fraud. He's like a what's his name? John G. Lake, or like the guy on Catch Me If You Can, right? Like they're these kind of people. And John Todd is going to be an occultist. He is going to be in the Jesus movement for a while, in the coffee house movement of the Jesus People movement, and then he's going to start trying to teach witchcraft among them. And he gets outed for that, and so then he's going to move to Ohio, and he's going to try to start a coven. And then he's going to come back, and he's going to start exposing the Illuminati conspiracy, okay? All of their theories are just repackaged John Birch theories about the Illuminati and the Jesuits and the New World Order and all this stuff. Only he's going to be pointing it to this group of witches called the Illuminati. Okay, this is where all your Illuminati theories come from. Remember, there was a real Illuminati back in around 1776. Okay, whoever they were probably doing their stuff between the 60s and the early 1800s in cooperation with the Freemasons. Most of that kind of goes underground, and if it turns to anything, it turns to low-key stuff that is within college fraternities and prophecy clubs after this. You don't really, maybe you have a dark, spooky Illuminati meeting somewhere, but you don't really have anything public coming out, okay? You don't really have this until John Todd starts talking about the witch group known as the Illuminati, okay? And this is where it all comes back. So you guys need to stop pointing stuff to the Illuminati. You need to stop saying he's a 33rd degree Freemason if you have not verified if somebody's a 33rd degree Freemason, because that's going to go around. It's going to be right alongside the communist conspiracy. Oh, he's a communist. Oh, he's a 33rd degree Freemason. If you know that for certain, say it. If you don't, don't, because you're going to find this in websites all over the place. He's a 33rd degree Freemason. He's a 33rd degree Freemason. Okay? Prove it. Prove it. Or don't say it. Okay? Don't repeat stuff, because this kind of misinformation has been circling around the evangelical church by people who are connected with the CIA and connected with right-wing libertarian groups, which libertarianism is just a basis for eventual fascism. You need to understand how economics and politics work, and how basically everything libertarianism does, it does not benefit you. Okay, at least not economically. Okay, yes, freedom is kind of good if you got money, but if you don't, having the government come up with some programs that allow you to get trained and get educated and, get a start to get towards having a better job than just being one of these guys low-paid factory grunts, where every time someone tries to unionize for better wages, the whole union is fired, and they just get a bunch of other low-paid factory grunts because they're propagating against minimum wage laws being immoral, right? All that stuff benefits the rich industrialists. And these rich industrialists are the same guys behind the CIA. Rich industrialists are the same guys behind libertarian. They're the same guys behind Austrian economics. And it's largely going to be to the benefit of the traditional core of the Calvinists. Those are the guys who are the old money in America. Okay? So anyways, John Wade Todd is going to do this. He's going to spread the Illuminati thing around. And you're going to find a bunch of these guys popping up in a short order. There's going to be like 3 or 4 of them that pop up, and they're circulating around. Just like you have all these fake faith healers that all pop up, like one after another, you're going to have these, I was next witch, I was the next Illuminati, I was the next Jesuit guys pop up one after another. And they're exposing the secrets because now they got saved, right? This is always what it is. And Christians eat this up, and they get paid to go around speaking, and they make money on it. And when you follow these guys long enough, you're going to find sexual abuse, you're going to find physical violent abuse, you're going to find in and out of alcoholism and mental hospitals. Sometimes you're going to find homosexuality, sometimes you're going to find other forms of fraud. It's the same thing you find among the faith healers. But now you're going to have these I was an ex-Illuminati guys. You're going to have the same thing pop up after 9/11. You're going to have 3 guys who are total frauds claiming to be ex-Muslim terrorists and telling you about the big bad boogeyman and how it's all connected. All Islamic terrorism is one big organization, and they're right at your doorstep, and they're about to take over your country, and we need to all basically side with the new right-wing Republican war that is like going to make a bunch of mess and make a bunch of money for a select few people and not solve any problems and create 50 more than they started with. Okay? This is what they've been doing since the beginning of the Cold War. Okay? And they just switched from the communist boogeyman to the Islamic boogeyman. Okay? So Jack Chick is going to publish numerous tracts about these guys' stories, and he's going to popularize them among independent Baptists and Charismatics. This is where these guys are going to be popular, okay? It's not going to be till like, I think like the 80s and, this is going to start in the 60s, and it's not going to be till like the 80s and 90s that these guys are exposed, so they're doing this for a while. These conspiracies are circulating around the church for a while, okay? And they're all frauds. So that's what's going on with the John Birch Society and the King James Onlyists, okay? There's a lot of intersection with them and KKK and Freemasons, okay? Now remember, you're also going to have William Branham, who is a charismatic fake faith healer, and he's in conjunction with the the KKK from his childhood till the end of his life. He's never not working with the KKK. Okay, so William Branham he's going to die in 1965. But William Branham is going to basically be a fake faith healer and claim to have all these words from the Lord and stuff like this. He's super creepy. He is actually going to circulate with Jim Jones. He is going to help make Jim Jones popular. Jim Jones was a smaller time so-called faith healer, same kind of charismatic guy, and he's going to start getting William Branham on his ticket to basically promote himself, because William Branham's already popular. And he is eventually going to start a cult in Guyana, Africa, in a town called Jonestown, and that is going to turn into a suicide cult, okay? There's like 5 of these cults that we know of at least that are attached to William Branham, okay? William Branham basically, he's the start of all this stuff, okay? And Oral Roberts basically uses William Branham to launch his career, okay? Once Oral Roberts, because Oral Roberts is much more polished, he's much more savvy, he's kind of just generally better looking, like less sketchy looking. I'm going to show you a picture of him. Oral Roberts is just like a slick, like he's just a salesman. I mean, he just has the look of a guy who could sell you a rock, right? And then William Branham just looks like he was abused, and there's just something super sketchy about him, okay? These are the guys who are launching the faith healing circuit after Maria Woodworth Etter and John G. Lake and John Alexander Dowie and all those guys basically phase out and die, you know, by like the 1920s, 1930s, okay? These guys are going to all pop up in the 1940s. Oral Roberts is going to piggyback off of him to launch his career, and then Kenneth Hagin is going to piggyback off Oral Roberts to launch his career, and then he's going to not become as famous as these guys in terms of the preaching circuit, but he's going to start Rhema Bible Institute, which is going to launch all your televangelists. So Kenneth Copeland, Joyce Myers, Creflo Dollar, all these people are going to come from Kenneth Hagin, okay? But Oral Roberts actually becomes so mainstream, and he's on TV. He's one of the first guys to jump on TV doing this stuff. He is going to get props from Billy Graham, and they're going to circulate around each other. Okay, they're not really preaching together, but they're going to visit each other's meetings and generally say good things about each other. Okay, Well, that's going to circulate down to keeping William Branham relevant, even though he is much more sketchy and much more charismaniac in terms of the stuff he's doing. Much more slain in the spirit stuff, much more crazy going on, and of course the KKK association. But he's going to stay popular, and a lot of faith healers, as tent show faith healing is kind of dying out for televangelism, you're going to have other guys that latch on to William Branham, and they're going to keep popularizing this stuff. Well, as his career moves on, now we're getting into the 1950s and 1960s, certain guys that were proteges of his, or joined to his ministry, and now they're trying to spin off and do their own thing. You're going to have guys like Paul Cain. Well, Paul Cain is going to become a remote viewer for the CIA. Paul Cain basically disappears in like the 1950s. He reappears in the 1980s with the Mike Bickle crowd, NICOP. But he is basically going to be doing some stuff with William Branham. He's going to try to do his own thing. He is going to move to Phoenix. And towards the end, before he disappears, this is his own claim, is that Chuck Smith, who started Calvary Chapels, was actually involved with some of his shows that he did in Phoenix. And Chuck Smith was in Phoenix at that time. He was a Foursquare pastor that is working, that's Amy Semple McPherson's church, and he was working in, I think, Prescott, which is like, I think, a couple hours from Phoenix. So apparently he's involved in faith healing shows, and Foursquare Church was all about that stuff. So it's very likely that he was involved with that. He would have been a young guy in his 20s at the time. And then he's going to leave the Foursquare Church, and his family's going to move to California, and they're going to start pastoring a non-denominational church, and that's going to become, him and Lonnie Frisbee basically are going to launch the Calvary Chapel movement. Okay? So basically you're going to have William Branham is going to die in 1965. You're going to have Paul Cain kind of just disappear by 1958. He just disappears, and he's going to pop up in the 80s, and you're going to find out that he was working with Operation Stargate and MK Ultra in all the paranormal research that would have involved Nazi scientists and the CIA. Okay, that's what he's been doing. Okay, you're going to find pictures of Paul Cain with Bill Clinton, with George Bush, with Benjamin Netanyahu. They sent him to visit Saddam Hussein. Like, Paul Cain is an occultist to the level of government. Okay, this is a premier creep, and we're going to get to him later, and it's going to be a major whacked out thing that is going to be fundamental in the launching of the new Apostolic Reformation. Okay, so meanwhile, you're going to have William Branham die in 1965. And it's going to create a lot of fallout, because he has been basically creating this fake faith healing, serpent seed doctrine, all this crazy stuff. And his followers, it's just wherever you find his followers, you're going to find abuse, you're going to find fallout, you're going to find church splits. He's either just a liar or a demoniac or both. Okay? He's an evil man. And Jim Jones is going to say about him that he admitted that he never believed the Bible, but it's the only way you can make a living. That's what Jim Jones, again, it's Jim Jones, so he's psycho himself. But he might be a true believer because he killed himself. Okay? Jim Jones, there's going to be a guy in 1988 who's going to come out with this expose about the Jim Jones cult, and he thinks it's an MK Ultra experiment, the whole thing. And what you end up having is how this stuff is all tied together is basically there's a congressman who goes down to Jonestown because people are telling him that this Jim Jones cult, which started in Indiana, is now in Guyana in South America, and basically these people are being kept prisoners there, and there's all kinds of abuse and stuff going on. A congressman from San Francisco who's a Democrat is going to go check this out. I don't know if he's going to try to get American intervention going on. I don't know what he's doing. But this same congressman is trying to push for more congressional oversight over the CIA, because the CIA has been basically from the 40s to, this is 1978, has been operating with almost no oversight. They've been overthrowing countries for, to the benefit of private interests. They have been very instrumental in launching false flag wars and stuff. We know Vietnam was based on a false flag Bay of Tonkin incident, and there's just all kinds of just messy crap that's going on with the CIA. And not only that, you have people believing the CIA assassinated Kennedy, which is very likely. You have connections between the CIA and the Bush family, and of course the Bush family was connected to the Nazis. There's just so much stuff in the CIA that sketch. And this congressman who wants to have more congressional oversight, he mysteriously gets killed when he's trying to leave Guyana. And so this guy in 1988, I was reading his book. He is basically, I don't know who the guy is. I think he's like a Stanford University guy. And it's basically like a thesis or something. But he is basically writes this like 700-page thing about how he thinks basically that Guyana and Jonestown was an MK Ultra experiment. And basically they used it to off the guy who was trying to expose the CIA, but also expose Jonestown. And then right after that, everybody in Jonestown kills themselves. This is the official story. Did they kill themselves, or were they killed by the CIA? I don't know. I'm just telling you what other people are speculating, okay? And then all these witnesses and other people are dying violent deaths, and he's accounting all this stuff, and this is 10 years later, and he's trying to keep track of all of it, and he's basically, it's an ongoing unsolved whodunit, basically, with Jonestown. So it's more than just Jim Jones' charismatic personality that led a bunch of people to kill themselves. It could have been just demonic. It could have been CIA. It could have been something much bigger going on, but we know CIA is doing mind control experiments and experimenting on people without their knowledge. We know this, okay? So William Branham is going to die. He's going to have sketchy people all over aligned with him, and everywhere his ministry's been is been a mess. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have a group of 5 guys led by an 8-year associate of William Branham, with a guy named Ern Baxter, okay? Ern Baxter is going to get together 5 guys known as the Pensacola Five. Now, Ern Baxter was basically a Canadian guy who is going to meet William Branham he's like a traveling evangelist. He's actually a musician who travels with another evangelist in Canada, and he's going to somehow intersect with William Branham, and William Branham's going to tell him that the angel of the Lord appeared to him and told him to invite him along to co-minister with him. And Ern Baxter is going to work with Branham for like 8 years, okay, before he departs from him, because he's realizing, like, this is what he's going to say, he's seriously wrong. But he's working with him from 47 to 54, so 7 years. Takes him 7 years to figure out who that William Branham is messed up, okay? But here's the thing. Ern Baxter, his dad is a Presbyterian, and his mom is a Holiness Pentecostal. So he's been in the bridge between Charismatic and Calvinist his whole life, okay? Supposedly his mom is drunk in the spirit type stuff. She's a crazy Charismatic, and his dad is a intellectual Presbyterian, okay? So he's going to meet William Branham, and William Branham's crazy, but his mom's crazy. So he's like, okay, this stuff's not that crazy. And for 7 years, he's going to be in it. And then he's going to leave because Branham is jacked up. He's probably going to learn about a serpent seed doctrine and all this other crazy stuff, and he's going to leave. Well, Ernst Baxter is going to end up becoming a very well-known person in the missionary evangelistic circuit. And when I say missionary and evangelist, I am not talking about go plant, a camp and a medical outpost in, some country in Africa, and then, try to educate the people and try to feed them and try to teach them the Bible until, Christianity spreads. I'm talking circulate the crowd and try to do the new thing that God's doing and stir up revival. That kind of missionary, okay? It's not really missionary stuff, if we're being honest, okay? So anyways, these guys, Ern Baxter is going to get very well known from Canada, US, UK, and Australia. Very well known. He travels everywhere, okay? Mind you, he's ditched William Branham from 1954. So 11 years later, William Branham's going to die, and he is going to come back, and he is going to try to stabilize and organize basically William Branham's movement, okay? And so there's these churches that are falling apart and going off the rails in Pensacola, Florida, and he's going to get together 5 guys in Pensacola, Florida. Let's see if I can find this. 5 guys in Pensacola, Florida that are going to include Derek Prince, who's obsessed with casting out demons out of Christians. Derek Prince is going to be the guy. Now, I've listened to his stuff, and you people listen to Derek Prince. He's got an English accent. He grew up in India, and people think because of that, he just sounds eloquent. He sounds smart. He sounds reasonable, okay? Here's a Derek Prince teaching. Here's an example of a Derek Prince teaching that was given to me. If you've ever masturbated before, you have demons in your fingers. Okay? So a lot of people apparently have demons in their fingers, and literally you like repent of masturbating and you do spirit fingers, like to shake the demons out of your fingers. Okay? That's an example of a Derek Prince teaching. Okay? These guys in these the deliverance ministries are going to come up with generational curses. Let's go back. Oh, it turns out like somebody in your family line in the 1800s was a Freemason. That's why you have a demon. They're going to come up with all these reasons why people have demons. And what you're going to find out is like, oh no, actually that person is just really angry inside because they've been being molested by the Sunday school teacher since 1985. Okay, these are true stories. I'm just making up the details, okay? But these are true stories. But we think they're demonized. We think they have a demon. Or they're being molested by the Sunday school teacher and they're flipping out whenever the Sunday school teacher's around. That's what's happening, okay? That kind of stuff is happening. And you're going to have guys like Hobart Freeman, and you're going to have Derek Prince, and Don Basham is another guy who's going to be into this deliverance. It's all about just casting out demons. Everything's a demon, okay? They're not going to really teach discipleship and growth and about how you resist the devil and he'll flee from you, because there is a devil and the devil can mess with Christians, and including stuff that's going to seem like demonization if you believe the devil and do what the devil tells you to do. It's like a Christian can be hypnotized, a Christian can be demonized, okay? But that doesn't mean they're possessed, okay? But the idea is to teach people, where their demonic activity is rooted in sin and unforgiveness. That's usually always what it is, and that's biblical. It says you'll be given over to tormentors until you give what is due, which is forgiveness. If you don't forgive, if Christ has forgiven you, but you don't forgive others, you can be given over to tormentors. He's talking about demons, okay? Satan can really mess with you if you don't forgive people. If you try to justify hatred and bitterness towards people who've wronged you in the past, it's just going to eat you up. And the same thing if you keep sin in your life and you won't repent of it, it's going to eat you up, okay? And that's going to give Satan more and more control in your life because you're obeying him every time you sin. It's that simple. A man is subject to whom he obeys, okay? But they're going to turn it into all this stuff about soul ties and generational curses. And that one time you looked at a Ouija board when you were 12, even though you're 35, and you did it once and then you became a Christian 12 years later, you still got to get these demons out from the past stuff you did. And they're going to make everything a demon, okay? So those are going to be Don Basham and Derek Prince. The other guys are going to be, and these are going to be the main guys, and these guys are going to basically bring Calvinism into the Charismatic Church, okay? You have Bob Mumford, Bob Mumford, Ern Baxter, and Charles Simpson, okay? Now, this group is going to get together, and they're going to artificially start a pentarchy, okay? Now, remember, the Catholic Church really started when a group of 5 quote-unquote pentarchs basically dealt with Constantine at the Council of Nicaea to come up with these 5 guys over all the churches in the Roman Empire and basically within the jurisdiction of wherever those churches were planted, okay? This is a totally made-up thing. It's not biblical. It's not apostolic, but we end up with the 5 archbishops, okay? That starts the Roman Catholic Church, okay? These guys are basically going to do that. So if you look at the called the Pensacola 5 shepherding movement, okay? If you look at pictures of these guys, the Pensacola 5, you have a pentarchy of charismaniacs now, okay? And this is what the new Apostolic Reformation is going to return as in the year 2000, okay? It's a group of guys basically saying, we will be mutually submitted to each other, just like the pentarchy, and we're going to be an authority structure over this new charismatic non-denominational stuff. Remember, by this time, the charismatic renewal is kicking off, okay? And so you don't just have the Pentecostal denominations that came out of Azusa Street. You have all these non-denominational, unaffiliated, charismatic churches of a mixture of Pentecostalism, the faith healing movement, and then people who are getting into speaking in tongues and then being outed from their denominational churches. And so it's filling up fast. There's a lot of these churches filling up fast, and these guys basically set themselves up to basically say, we're the spiritual authorities of it, okay? Basham is a Baptist, and I don't know a whole lot about Don Basham. but he's a Baptist deliverance minister. He's probably following Hobart Freeman stuff because he was a Baptist as well. Derek Prince is going to be born as to an Indian missionary couple, but he's going to be involved with the Pentecostals. Bob Mumford is going to be a Navy guy, and he's going to come up later because another Navy guy who he's going to be friends with is Rick Joyner. Rick Joyner is going to publish his books later on. And then Erwin Baxter and Charlie Simpson, I believe, Erwin Baxter is obviously from a Presbyterian background, and I think Charlie Simpson might be from a Reformed background, but they're Charismatics, okay? These guys are going to get into R.J. Rushdoony, okay? So these guys are going to start a magazine called New Wine. Now, the church I grew up in my elementary school years was called New Wine Christian Fellowship. It was definitely highly influenced by this stuff. This shepherding movement is basically going to, some of the stuff that they're going to be influenced by are the writings of Watchman Nee. The reason is because they're starting an organic church movement, a lot of house churches, and that eventually grow to become building churches. But they start out as a lot of house churches that are charismatic in orientation, really focused on the gifts and deliverance. My grandfather had one of these churches in his basement. I didn't know where this stuff came from. And they're going to come up with these inordinate rules about authority. So if you have heavy-handed parents, okay, and you come from the charismatic background, and they treat these rules like authority, almost like you're blessed and cursed based on following your parents, even into your adulthood, okay, even if their decisions are bad. This comes from the shepherding movement. So the shepherding movement is going to be reading Watchman Nee. And Watchman Nee is basically a guy who is, he was going to be a lawyer, and then this is going to be in the early 1900s, he's going to quit the potential to be a lawyer, and he's going to become essentially a leading theologian among the Chinese home church movement. Okay, this is 1930s. And he's going to publish stuff into the 1970s. And I used to have a couple of his books. I used to have The Normal Christian Life and Spiritual Authority of his. My grandfather was very big into this. Watchman Nee is going to come up with these ideas about authority, comparing not just parental relationships, but pastoral relationships to King Saul or to the prophet Samuel. What they're going to do is they're going to take stories from David and Saul and Samuel and apply this to your church, and it's going to create a lot of room for pastoral abuse, because they're going to compare it to how David wouldn't break away from Saul and start his own thing. He basically had to deal with Saul's abuse until God killed Saul. Okay, well, you're talking about overthrowing a king versus leaving a pastor who's abusive and teaching false doctrine, okay? But again, he's writing this stuff for the Chinese house church movement, and he's basically saying, this is how we should organize, and this is how you guys should understand the authority, and he's trying to, work towards keeping the house church movement in China unified, okay? Well, these guys are going to adopt this into the shepherding movement. And they're going to come up with theories about pastoral authority, and what it's going to turn into is a pyramid scheme of tithing up to essentially get endorsement to abusive guys. That's really what it turns into. So basically, these guys are getting tithes up from other pastors who are their authority. It's like an honor, giving honor to where honors due, quote, quote. And it's going to be like a system like lords and fiefdoms and stuff like that. But it's all spiritual, okay? And these guys are going to claim to be a covering. So if you hear people talking about being their spiritual covering, this all comes from this, okay? And these guys basically just get together and say, well, we'll be that. And probably they all know William Branham. That's probably how they get the reputation in the first place. We know Ernst Baxter toured with William Branham for 7 years, and he's got a lot of clout among Pentecostal and charismatic missionaries and evangelists, and with William Branham. So that's where he starts with this stuff, okay? And he brings these 5 guys together, and it says essentially we're the pentarchy over the charismatic movement. That's really what they're doing. And they send out this magazine called New Wine from the 1960s to 1987, I think, is when they quit, okay? Well, most people think this movement died out in the 1980s, and it did not, okay? This is Charles Simpson, okay? This is his New Wine magazine. Starts publishing in 1969, quits publishing in 1987, okay? Well, what most people don't know about this is they're going to publicly repent of the shepherding stuff, because you're going to have like Baptists and Reformed people and all these people calling out the abuse that's coming out of these movements, because you have these guys basically tithing upstream to them to be asserted as that's your authority, and spreading around, we're in charge of you, you got to do what we say. And they're destroying churches, kicking people out, getting people to tithe to them excessively, and then covering up their abuse, because the principles in this is going to be basically like David and Saul. Okay, David wouldn't touch Saul. Don't touch the Lord's anointed. It is all going to come from this. Okay, well, this movement doesn't ever go away. These guys are going to publicly repent of it and then change the name of New Wine Magazine to, you're going to love this, Christian Conquest Magazine. That's what it turns into, and it's still publishing. Okay? These guys didn't repent of this stuff. They basically just publicly repented and kept going, and these guys are going to prop up the Mike Bickle movement and the New Apostolic Reformation. That's what it's going to turn into. Okay? They say, now remember, Ernst Baxter, who was a follower of William Branham for a while, and then he starts the shepherding movement, he is going to start partnering up with R.J. Rushdoony. Now, R.J. Rushdoony you need to understand his stuff, okay? R.J. Rushdoony, this is in the 60s when he starts getting popular. He teaches, this is very important, he teaches keeping Mosaic food laws, okay? He teaches basically restoring a Mosaic law system over the world eventually. He teaches that stoning people to death must come back. He teaches literally in his philosophy, like lying about being a virgin is a death sentence. Okay, stuff like that. What you're going to have pop up after R.J. Rushdoony is going to come back is Messianic Judaism. Jews who want to keep, we're Jewish Christians, but we want to practice all the Jewish stuff. We're not saying you legalistically have to, but they are saying you legalistically have to. Get to know enough of them up close. They are saying they believe they have to, and the Holy Spirit's telling them to. Okay? They're going to get into Jewish food laws. They're going to get into Sabbath keeping. They're going to get into all this stuff because he believes, this is standard Calvinist theology. They just switch Saturday to Sunday. He believes that the Decalogue is still binding on everyone. Okay? And Christians will keep it, quote unquote. They're going to use 1 John. I think it's like 1 John 2, where he says, those who are born of God keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. John is referring to Jesus' new commandment to love one another. Okay, well, they're going to say he's referring to the Decalogue. And this circulates around Reformed churches. I've been in Reformed Baptist churches where they say it's the Decalogue. We're still under the Ten Commandments, okay? They believe they're still under the Ten Commandments. And so these guys are basically going to teach that the Ten Commandments are there, and Christians will keep it willingly, but that is going to be the basis for essentially controlling and executing the unregenerate who won't submit to the law. And they're saying eventually this needs to be the law of the land. Now I need you guys to hear this, because this is a movement that started in the Reformed Church, and it's very much seeped into the Charismatic Church and the modern Gospel Coalition and all these guys. Okay? The modern theonomy movement is based on advancing Rushdoony, and Rushdoony wrote a lot of stuff and propagated a lot of stuff. Now, Rushdoony was just, again, this is an Armenian guy, an Orthodox guy who becomes an evangelical Presbyterian, which is more liberal, and then he's going to become an Orthodox Presbyterian, which is more conservative. And he is going to start propping up, among his other ideas, libertarian economic theory. So he's going to popularize the Austrian School of Economics, and that's where Peter Drucker comes from, okay? So he's going to prop up a guy who's friends with Peter Drucker, and Peter Drucker is going to be advancing Austrian School of Economics in the business world, and basically his management systems in the business world, and then that's going to come into the church through Peter Drucker, or through Robert Schuller and Rick Warren and those guys, okay? They're all in California. All this stuff is going to be like LA and San Francisco area, okay? Rushdoony is going to be huge in the Christian homeschool movement because Rushdoony is going to advance presuppositional apologetics. He's going to advance libertarian values on schooling, so he's going to be anti-public school and pro-homeschool, and he's going to be sending out stuff all over America to the homeschooling movement, which you're going to have a lot of people in the Jesus hippie movement, a lot of people in the Charismatic home church movement are also going to be into homeschooling, okay? So he's going to be sending out stuff to all these people, and then he's going to be propped up by this Volker Fund, okay? The William Volker Fund is going to basically be a German private fund by some rich German industrialist who essentially is propping up libertarians, okay? Now, he's espousing libertarian economic views among Christians, and so they like this. Remember, in the Cold War, anything that props up libertarianism is going to be very popular. It's like the John Birch Society is going to love Ron Paul. The Volker Fund is going to prop up Ron Paul, okay? But they're going to prop up Rushdoony. And so the reason Rushdoony goes from being like a missionary to the Indians in Nevada to basically working for some Presbyterian university to basically working independently and publishing a bunch of stuff is because this Volker Fund is sponsoring him to just sit there and write, okay? Well, the Volker Fund is going to be managed by a guy eventually named Gary North. And Gary North is going to marry Rushdoony's daughter. Okay, and Gary North is bat-poo crazy, okay? Gary North ends up going and living off the grid and thinking Y2K is going to end the world. But Gary North is behind the scenes, and he's advancing conspiracy theories, and he's advancing, anti-NWO stuff and Illuminati stuff, and he is going to advance, the people who are, going to eventually lead to the Ron Pauls and the Alex Joneses of the world, okay? Gary North just died, I think, in 2022. Gary North gets found by this woman because this is a woman who actually recently became a Christian, and she's now in with J.D. Greear and Tim Keller, and Al Mohler's reading her stuff. I gotta think of her name, Molly Worthen. Okay, so Molly Worthen is basically she recently got saved. Okay, like in the past year she got saved, and I was going to reach out to her, but she's like a baby Christian, and I don't want to dump a bunch of drama on her lap, okay? But she writes a paper it's called What's Wrong with Chalcedon, okay? Well, when you hear the theological triage that's being propped up by Al Mohler that is talking about how we all need to unite the church, they're going to start out saying around the Council of Nicaea and Chalcedon and treat everything else like secondary issues and not divide over it, okay? That's R.J. Rushdoony's idea. His idea was the Chalcedon Foundation, and basically he wants to unify all of Christendom back to the Council of Chalcedon, which is before you get into the only ecumenical councils that really happen after that are the ones dealing with icons, which is basically idolatry in the church, okay? So if you go back to Chalcedon, you have a church that is post-Augustinian, post-Nicene, and then you get the Christology that kicks out the Nestorians and the Monophysites, and he looks at it as like that's a form of orthodoxy that Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox can all agree on, and so that's why his organization is called the Chalcedon Foundation, okay? So that's where theological triage comes from, okay? And this is going to be pushed by the Calvinists, okay? He is going to be very popular among Calvinists because he comes up with a complete philosophy for this. Well, before she was a Christian, now she's professing a Calvinist. So she became a Christian, and unfortunately, she's being influenced by the who's who of the Gospel Coalition, basically. Because the Gospel Coalition read her stuff, and she's like, she's outing Rushdoony and stuff like this, and we need to listen to this, okay? Because these guys are very influenced by Rushdoony, and she's right in her criticisms of him. She finds Gary North, okay, and he's off the grid. And literally, she's doing her research. Again, she's got her PhD in like history and like American religious studies, okay? Teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. And she's tracing this stuff, and she's tracing the influence of the John Birch Society, the Council on National Policy, all of these same groups that you hear me and John Bryson talk about. She's, as an academic, researching these influences on the formation of the evangelical right. Very good resource, okay? Her stuff is very sound, okay? And now she's a Christian. Well, she gets kind of famous because Christianity Today does a piece on her because they want to stick it to the Calvinists, and basically That's where her stuff comes in. Anyways, in her stuff, she's trying to find Gary North, and she asks a Gary North follower how to find him. And he says, Gary North is hard to find. He said, if you really want to find him, you're going to need a gang of bloodhounds and a bat signal. But the easiest way to get a hold of him is to publish something on the internet that says, Gary North, Dr. North, you're the only one who can answer this question, because he's full of himself, okay? And Gary North still has a website. You can find GaryNorth.com with all kinds of economic conspiracy theory stuff on it, okay? He responds to her, and he tells her, and this is in correspondence between the two of them, that basically, remember, he's part of the Volkner Fund that funded R.J. Rushdoony, and then he married Rushdoony's daughter. So he's a handler for Rushdoony, okay? He tells her that they basically influenced the Dominion theology. This is how I got on this train, that the Dominion theology comes from them. And they tell them that they basically spread around Rushdoony's ideology across the world, which is Mosaic law legalism, okay? And then they let the main core movement die so it could basically morph into all these other versions of it that they can gather up later, okay? And they're basically saying that's the plan, is that we wanted this ideology to seep into these other denominational movements that wouldn't otherwise work together, and now this common thread is among them, okay? That's literally Satan's MO. Gary North is basically saying we're doing that, okay? So what happens? Gary North and R.J. Rushdoony start conflicting like by the 80s, okay? Gary North goes off the grid and he goes crazy. R.J. Rushdoony becomes an editor on New Wine Magazine. This is the Charismatic New Wine Magazine. Remember, he goes from sending out tons of stuff that's influencing the homeschool movement to now he's working with Ernst Baxter, and he's an editor by like the early 1980s. Or yeah, I think it's the early 1980s on New Wine Magazine, and that would also make him an editor on Conquest Magazine. Let's see here. Nope, I didn't find it. My friend John found basically citations on these magazines that have R.J. Rushdoony as an editor. Okay, so remember, you have two bad ideas that are going to start to mix. Okay, you have the shepherding movement, which is just artificial spiritual authority, with R.J. Rushdoony's hardcore postmillennial dominionism. Okay, they're mixing, and in the New Wine Magazine, Ernst Baxter creates Kingdom Now Dominion theology. He's writing about how the tension he's in being, he's always lived in both sides of the Calvinist postmillennial dominionism and the charismatic gifts and stuff like this. And he sees the extremes on both sides, and he's going to try to glue the two together. Remember, charismatic and Calvinist, okay? Now, we're going to get into the Catholic connection in a minute, but this is what he's doing on purpose. Okay, he's doing it systematically. Remember, he's publishing this magazine. He doesn't really publish a lot of books. Him and Bob Mumford, like Bob Mumford publishes a couple books through Rick Joyner's Morning Star Ministries in, I think, like the late 80s. He's going to publish some stuff in the early 2000s, I think, or other people are going to publish his stuff, which is like after the New Apostolic Reformation's been created. So he's doing a lot of this on the DL, okay? But he is basically going to start shifting the charismatics against dispensationalism and futurism, and basically they'll call it negative eschatology. The idea that we're on a sinking ship as the world goes apostate. We keep preaching the gospel, but eventually we're going to get raptured and take it out of here, and Christ is going to have to come rule for 1,000 years because it's going to get very anti-Christian in this world. Okay. That's the true biblical doctrine, but the postmillennialists think we're going to usher in Christ's kingdom, and then Christ is going to come and sit on his throne once we've basically put all his enemies under his feet. Okay, they're going to look at the church as doing that for him. Okay, so Rushdoony and Ernst Baxter are going to start forming these ideas, and they're going to keep spreading them throughout the charismatic world in the 80s to the present as Kingdom Now Dominion theology, okay? So that's what's going on with these guys, okay? Now, here's where the intersection comes, and this is where the Catholics come in too, okay? So in 1977, you're going to have a Kansas City Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. Remember, the Jesus people movement, the whole charismatic movement and the spreading of charismatic stuff through the faith healing stuff, through the Pentecostals, has been going on nonstop. It's not like it's just like, boom, now we have another outpouring. That's how they're going to sell it, but that's all BS, okay? What really makes the charismatic renewal popular is when Time magazine publishes the Jesus Revolution in, I think it's like 1971. In the late 60s, early 70s, that's when Lonnie Frisbee and Chuck Smith get together out of, and Lonnie Frisbee is an opening swinging homosexual that claims to have come to Jesus on acid. And Chuck Smith is basically, has left the Foursquare Church and Amy Semple McPherson's train wreck, okay? He was young when Amy Semple McPherson died, but then he's going to train up as a pastor not long after she dies. And then he's in that movement till the 50s. Well, that's what's going to make the charismatic renewal start to pop, and all of a sudden they're going to do this Explo 1972, which is they're going to bring in Billy Graham, and they're going to bring in, I forget his name, but Chris Christopherson, and the guy, I forget his name too, but the guy who basically starts the black gospel music genre. They're going to bring in the who's who of musicians and speakers into this Explo 72, and it's the guy, Bill Bright from Campus Crusade, that's going to organize this, okay? So, the Expo 72 is going to blow up, and it's going to have all these people popularizing speaking in tongues. And then what you're going to have is you're going to have these young Catholic students start to read this Pentecostal book called They Spoke with Other Tongues, and David Wilkerson's The Cross and the Switchblade, okay? And this is going to popularize charismania among the Catholics. So They Spoke with Other Tongues. I read that. You can find that at archive.com. I actually read this a long time ago, before I ever spoke in tongues. It's what got me to kind of first assess the speaking in tongues doctrine. I didn't speak in tongues till like years later, when I just happened to get the gift when, after completely reading the Bible as a young Christian. But this would be the book that the Pentecostals and the Charismatics passed around as like, this is the history of the charismatic movement. It's all BS. It whitewashes William Branham and all his homosexuality and stuff like that. Takes, crazy nutso John Dowie and John G. Lake and Maria Woodworth-Etter out of the picture. And it just basically makes it sound like the charismatic movement started just organically with an outpouring from God with William Branham, and then it turned into Azusa Street not long after, and it's just exploded in the charismatic movement ever since, okay? It's false. They whitewash it. They claim that the Mormons were a move of God and that they spoke in tongues. They claim that the Montanists were a move of God and they spoke in tongues. They whitewash Amy Semple McPherson, all these people, and they boil it down to a few people who basically bought onto the charismatic speaking in tongues thing. They tell like one or two stories about people speaking in tongues and hearing them in a known language, which are literally the only two stories I've ever found in Pentecostal history that claim believably legitimate testimonies of people speaking in tongues and people understanding them in known languages, okay? It's like these same two stories just circulate all over the place. You should have thousands of these stories, but you don't. You have two, okay? But it's going to talk about that, and you're going to have this, and then you're going to have David Wilkerson's Cross and the Switchblade. That's really what blows up the charismatic renewal among the Catholics now, okay? And among evangelicals in general, because David Wilkerson's book is going to get turned, The Cross and the Switchblade is going to get turned into a movie in like 1971, okay? $1970, okay? And it's going to have Pat Boone in it, and it's going to have Eric Estrada in it. Eric Estrada, I think he's on like Chips or some cop show or whatever, and Pat Boone was like a famous singer and stuff like that. And they're going to have the line in there, God can get you high, but he won't let you down, okay? And this is what's going on with the speaking in tongues movement. They're selling it to the Jesus hippies as an alternative to transcendental meditation and drugs. Okay, and so what you do is you have these guys speaking in tongues until they're brain numb, and supposedly they're going to have visions and out-of-body experiences and fall down and get healed and all this other stuff, okay? This is how they're selling speaking in tongues to everybody. Remember, it's picking up among the Jesus hippies, okay? And you have this very famous movement about David Wilkerson, who did a lot of legit stuff in New York, and he started Teen Challenge, which is all about getting kids off drugs, and it's going to have a lot of deliverance ministry stuff in it. It's going to have a lot of Pentecostalism in it, but it is going to successfully get a lot of people off drugs because it's focused on basically kids who are outcasts and the idea that God loves them and accepts them as they are. And there's going to be a lot of people in it that genuinely come out, okay? Same thing with the Jesus hippie movement. There's going to be a lot of genuine people who come off drugs and stuff and accept Christ, but they have an inclination towards wanting spiritual highs all the time, right? Because they had an inclination towards wanting highs, and a lot of them are not dealing systematically with their issues through discipleship. And instead, they're looking for these emotional highs that like eradicate their emotional issues and stuff like that miraculously, which I'm sure it happens in some cases, but that's not the norm. Just like healing can happen through doctors slowly over time, or it can happen through a miracle, it's not always the case that it's going to be a miracle. It's the same thing with the emotional stuff. And so these people are going to keep going places where they're looking for more spiritual highs. Well, Cross and Switchblade is going to help. The movie is going to help that. And then the book, They Spoke with Other Tongues, is going to be passed around among these Catholics. These Catholics are going to start doing this in, it starts out in a university, I think it's Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and then it spreads to Notre Dame in Ann Arbor among Catholic college students. And this movement is going to spread from there, and it's going to keep spreading throughout Catholic universities worldwide until 1975. Remember, this was 3 years later. The Pope is going to endorse it, and here's why. Charismatics and Pentecostals have been sheep stealing from the Catholic churches for 50 years now, or more. Because in a lot of these cultures where these people are into Spiritism, remember, the Catholic churches and a lot of these things are into Spiritism. They're still into superstition. They're still looking for emotional highs. The Pentecostals are going to be offering to them what they're missing as a mystical experience. And they're going to jump all on that. And a bunch of people are going to leave the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is going to be like, well, we need to get on board with this tongues thing. And it's the Pope. It's nobody else. It comes from the Pope. Okay, remember, the popes have already had Vatican II, which they're hoping to unify not just Christian religions, but all the world's religions against communism. That's what's going on in the 60s, okay? So by 1975, the Pope says that this charismatic renewal thing is going to unify the church. This is where it comes from. And so what they have in 1977 in Kansas, this is the same place where the Volker Group is funding. That's where Gary North comes from. This is where the Volker Group is funding R.J. Rushdoony from. You're going to also have in Kansas City the Charismatic Renewal Conference, and you're going to have Catholic speakers. You're going to have 2 of the 5 shepherding guys. You're going to have Charles Simpson and Ern Baxter are going to speak at this thing. Okay, I could be wrong. Could be him and Mumford, but it's 2 of the 5 of the shepherding movement are speaking at this thing. Okay, you're going to have Maria von Trapp from The Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music. The real Maria von Trapp is going to speak at this thing. Okay, you're going to have a number of Catholic speakers. You're going to have another number of Pentecostal speakers, and what they're going to preach is that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit is unifying the church in preparation for the soon coming end of the world. They're going to preach that this is going to be followed by a big persecution of the church, and this is preparing the church to be knitted together in love before that persecution. They're going to say the charismatic church is doing it, okay? This is 1977. So guess what happens? Guess what gets predicted 4 years after this? Chuck Smith, who everybody thinks is so sound, okay? Mind you, he's running around with Lonnie Frisbee, who was definitely a homosexual, bisexual swinger, okay? Chuck Smith is running around with Paul Kane, who is definitely an MK Ultra CIA asset, like demoniac spook, okay? Chuck Smith is going to predict the end of the world 3.5 years after this Kansas City conference. Okay? Chuck Smith was not so great. I'm not saying he's this evil guy. I'm not saying he's behind any nefarious plot. I'm saying he's not as discerning and wise as people want to make him out to be. Okay? He predicted the end of the world in 1981. Okay? Now, in Kansas City, this Kansas City Renewal Conference, you are going to have basically the who's who of charismatics, Catholic, evangelical, Episcopal, Pentecostal, all of them, all coming together saying that God is unifying the church through the charismatic outpouring and speaking in tongues. Okay? This is in 1977. Mind you, the shepherding movement is going on, doing the spiritual authority over these same charismatic groups at the same time, forming a Catholic-like pentarchy that leads to basically a hierarchy but it's all spiritual. It's not institutional. So it's literally like a spiritual version of Roman Catholicism coming over the charismatic movement. Okay? Meanwhile, the Pope is saying this is going to unify the whole church. So remember this, because in the early 2000s, you're going to have one thing conferences with Mike Bickle and Catholics and trying to unify the church back together with the Catholic Church. Todd White's going to get into this. Francis Chan's going to get into this. It's all circulating around Kansas City, where also the Volkner Group is funding R.J. Rushdoony at this time. Okay? So you've got Ern Baxter, you've got Bob Mumford. Somehow I haven't researched all this yet, but somehow he's protegeing Rick Joyner, who is going to pop up in the 1980s. Just start publishing in like 1986, and he's going to start Morning Star Ministries. He's going to take over a chunk of land where apparently the Moravians were, which Moravians were into sketchy, possibly demonic, occultic, mystical stuff. But he's going to take over a tract of land and basically start a ministry based around, nostalgia for the Moravians, called Morning Star Ministries. He's kind of doing his own thing. I don't know what's going on. I do know he was naval intelligence, and him and Bob Mumford were both in the Navy, and then he eventually is going to publish Bob Mumford's books. Okay, but that's one of the shepherding guys. Okay, the other shepherding guys are going to form the Kingdom Now movement, and then the other two shepherding guys are going to basically spread around deliverance ministry stuff. Okay, so the stuff that you see guys like Sorbin Sondergaard doing, okay, his people doing, comes from them. Okay, so this Kansas City Renewal Conference happens in 1977. In 1982, so 5 years after this, Mike Bickle shows up in Kansas City. Okay. Now, I just found this by somebody who claimed to be an OG with his ministry. This is on YouTube, but an OG with his ministry claimed that the guy who told him, he was apparently circulating around Kansas City. His official story, which is the only story that he's ever told, or at least that's publicized, is that he was in Cairo, Egypt, on some kind of trip or something like that, and God told him that he was going to change the expression of Christianity in one generation. Okay. What apparently the real story is, and maybe they're both part of the story, is that these people are saying that there was a guy in St. Louis who, and I'm trying to figure out who, prophesied over him and told him to go to Kansas City. Now, mind you, this is going on in Kansas City already. Okay, the Volkner Group's funding R.J. Rushdoony in Kansas City, and then Ernst Baxter and R.J. Rushdoony are promoting among all the charismatics this spiritual hierarchy and Kingdom Now Dominionism, okay? And Mike Bickle is going to be prophesied over by a so-called prophet in St. Louis who turns out to be a false prophet and a homosexual, okay? That guy tells him to go to St. Louis. He's going to go to St. Louis or to Kansas City from St. Louis, and he's going to go to Kansas City, and he's going to hook up with Bob Jones. Bob Jones has been running around. Remember, this is going to be like 1983, okay? Bob Jones has been running around since the 70s, okay? So he starts doing this in 1975. Remember, this is 1977, and Chuck Smith is preaching that the world's going to end in 1981, okay? Bob Jones is a guy who's an alcoholic. He's in and out of mental hospitals for years. He's apparently violent. He ends up going to a veterans mental hospital because of nervous issues, they say, which is basically he's psyching out, okay? I don't know if he's like a Vietnam vet. I don't know what he is, but he is in his 40s by the 80s, so he would have definitely been old enough to have been drafted into Vietnam. He might be a Vietnam vet. I don't know why he's in a veterans hospital. It seems like he could be a Vietnam vet, okay? Vietnam vets were known for obviously having sex a lot and doing LSD and raping and murdering, all kinds of stuff that went on in Vietnam, all kinds of bad stuff, okay? A lot of people came back messed up from this. I know people personally who've told me some really messed up stories. Vietnam messed people up, plus there was LSD, plus we know the CIA was deliberately experimenting on people. So we don't know what goes on, but a lot of them, people messed up from the Gulf War I and Vietnam, like legitimately the government did stuff to them. or they went through traumatic things that they're not able to get over. Okay. Anyways, he is going to be really messed up. He's not that coherent when he talks, and he's going to have all these wild stories. In 1975, he's going to be before that, I think. He is going to be in a mental hospital, and his story is that God told him he's full of bitterness and wants to kill all these people, and the devil's trying to get him to go murder a bunch of people. And his own story is that basically the devil is telling him, since he's been in a mental hospital and he's going to be crazy his whole life, he can just murder all the people he's mad at and he'll just be in the mental hospital. And his story is that Jesus appeared to him and told him either go murder those people or forgive them. And that was kind of the start of his walk with Jesus. But he's claiming to have had visions of like angels and stuff like that since he was 15 years old. Okay, I want to find out if Bob Jones was a Vietnam vet. I don't know, but he is messed up. He is going to be running around the local churches preaching doom and calling out people's sins, and claiming that the world's going to end, and all these doom and gloom prophecies and stuff like this. Mind you, these people are saying that the world's going to end in 1981. That's through Chuck Smith and the Jesus movement, and this is very much circulating around. Okay. This kind of stuff's going to keep happening. You're going to have 88 reasons why the world's going to end in 88 pop up after Chuck Smith's prophecy fails. And this guy's going to have like 5 more prophecies like that, okay? The reason they're saying this is because the Catholics and this Charismatic conference, which is the shepherding guys are promoting this idea that the Charismatic renewal is unifying the church before the end times, okay? That's why they keep predicting the end times. And so Mike Bickle and Bob Jones are going to get together, and Mike Bickle originally thinks Bob Jones is sketch because Bob Jones is sketch. But he's going to prophesy to Mike Bickle that it's a warm March, and he's going to prophesy a day when there's going to be a snowstorm. And, of course, the snowstorms. Bob Jones has familiar spirits. Bob Jones is able to tell people about their stuff that's always from their past. That is true, but he's a psycho, okay? And he's going to tell Mike Bickle a story about a conversation that took place between him and his dad and nobody else could have known. Okay? And that's where Mike Bickle is sold on Bob Jones. And remember, he's already been prophesied over. Now, I think he's a guy who's just deceived. I think that's how he starts out. Okay? He's just deceived. He's got a homosexual false prophet that prophesied him to. Now he's got this other guy who's kind of psycho and a false prophet prophesying over him. And he starts basically a movement, and what they start doing is they start going into churches and wrecking churches. Basically, it starts out with like a private like Bible study prayer group where they're propping up Bob Jones and his prophecies. And Bob Jones is going to develop all this stuff about how prophets can be like less than 50% accurate and still be a legit prophet. He's going to come up with these levels of prophecies and about activating and advancing levels. And these guys are going to start this ministry called Grace Fellowship Ministries, okay? It starts out with them taking over churches. So they start getting into these churches and getting people on board with Bob Jones' prophecies. And Bob Jones' prophecies, he comes up with this 1 billion soul harvest prophecy and about this great revival and all this stuff that's going to happen in the earth and what God's doing and how they need to come under the authority of these prophets. And then these other charismatic false prophets are going to circulate and come around, and they're going to become the Kansas City prophets. It all starts out with Mike Bickle and Bob Jones. And then these other vultures who circulate around the faith healing movements and these other movements, just like these other ones, are going to pop out. And you're going to have this one guy bring in Agnes Sanford's healing of the memory stuff, which is like psychotherapy, regressive psychotherapy meets charismania. Okay? And that's going to be, you're going to hear sozo healing or salts or these different things all came from that. Okay? It all comes from Agnes Sanford, which is a woman in the early 1900s who's mixing Freudian psychology with occult, with faith healing and deliverance. Okay, that's what's going on. And these people keep coming up with these elaborate schemas of how this and that heals you and activates you and gets you ready for your blessing or your healing or whatever. But they're always pouring on these people delusions of grandeur where God has this earth-shattering mission for them. But they've got to do all this stuff to get it. And it's always based around coming into alignment and submitting to these prophets, because this is the shepherding movement. And basically coming under their authority and stuff like that. Well, here's what goes on. You're going to have a handful of these guys join. I think there's like 5 of 6 of these Kansas City false prophets. They're all bona fide false prophets, and they're still running around the movement. They're eventually all going to get outed as like sexual deviants and scam artists, okay? Just like the faith healers before them were, okay? But you have this floating around, this idea that this charismatic renewal is going to usher in the end of the world. And so these guys keep coming up with these prophecies about how God's going to do this. Okay? And so as this is going on, they managed to split and take over these churches in Olaf, Kansas, and they're doing this through the 80s. Now, all of a sudden, Paul Cain, who's been off everyone's radar for 20 years because he's been working with the CIA, shows up into this movement, okay? Now, Bob Jones, I'm going to show you Bob Jones here, is going to teach people that God is basically going to treat like false prophesying like a baby pooping its pants. And you get better over time, but you're mostly going to get a lot of stuff wrong. And what they really mean is, like, you want to keep going until your prophecies are more and more vague, so that way, if they're wrong, you can't really prove they're wrong, okay? It just means get practice lying to people, is what he's saying. And Bob Jones is going to be, he is the core of all this, okay? Now, he hasn't been outed for anything scandalous yet. Mike Bickle's propping him up, and these other prophets are showing up, and they're reinforcing this and telling people that they need to, prophecies that they need to submit to these guys in order for God's big thing to happen, okay? And so their movement is becoming increasingly culty. Meanwhile, Paul Cain somehow knows people in the Jesus movement, and I think it's through Chuck Smith, because he starts hooking up with John Wimber, and he's into the signs and wonders, and Chuck Smith is kind of deviating away from the signs and wonders stuff and pushing the people who are more into signs and wonders all the time towards the Vineyard movement, okay? He's not saying anything they're doing is wrong. He's just saying you'd fit in better with that movement because they're more about signs and wonders. So Paul Cain mysteriously reappears among John Wimber and among the Kansas City Prophets. The Kansas City Prophets are being circulated by John Wimber, and we need to tell you a little bit about John Wimber. So John Wimber is a righteous, he was a pianist for the Righteous Brothers, okay? And he is basically going to become a Calvary Chapel guy. He gets saved in, I forget what movement he gets saved in, but he gets saved, and he becomes a Quaker minister, and then he becomes a Calvary Chapel guy, okay? He disagrees with Chuck Smith because he really wants to emphasize signs and wonders more, okay? And so Chuck Smith says, well, maybe you should go join this Vineyard movement then, because that would be better for you. And the Vineyard movement, which is started by this Gullickson couple, is where Lonnie Frisbee goes after Chuck Smith rejects him trying to make it all about signs and wonders. Now, mind you, this whole time, Chuck Smith doesn't totally know this yet, but this whole time, Lonnie Frisbee's a homosexual swinger, okay? And he's still doing drugs, okay? You need to hear this. He's a homosexual swinger who is still doing drugs. The whole movement started about how he was doing drugs and Jesus came and he went away from all this and now he just wants Jesus. But the reality is he's still a homosexual swinger and doing drugs, okay? So after he gets outed by Chuck Smith for he basically leaves the Calvary Chapels because Chuck Smith tries to shut down the too much signs and wonders stuff. He's going to hook up with the Gullicksons, and the Gullicksons are basically going to start the Vineyard movement. They do it independently of him, but he's going to be circulating in that crowd now. And the Gullicksons basically are a couple who started a group among the Los Angeles music crowd. They have famous people in their group. They have Bob Dylan in their group, who has come out as having sold his soul to the devil since then, okay? John Wimber is a Righteous Brothers pianist, and so these guys know the music scene in Los Angeles, okay? They're in it, and they start making the church centered around really two things: great music and signs and wonders, okay? It's not the Calvary Chapels that do that, it's the Vineyards. Great music and signs and wonders, and they're blowing up. The Vineyards are blowing up. Basically, since the Assemblies of God, the biggest movements in the charismatic movement, you have the Assemblies of God that are always big, but it's really the Vineyards and the independent charismatic churches that are largely influenced by the Vineyards that blow up. And the Calvary Chapels keep growing, but they're going to be more sound in doctrine and less charismaniac, and so they're not going to be as popular. And they're always going to have like a couple of guys, it's like a guy with a guitar is pretty much all they're going to have. While these guys get into the full-scale band and having top-notch music because they're pulling people from the music industry in LA. And so guess what? When you put on a better show, more people are going to enjoy it, okay? And so these guys are going to be growing the Vineyard Church, and they're going to start platforming the Kansas City Prophets and Paul Cain. Okay? Now, Paul Cain is a remote viewer with the CIA. He's messed up. Don't know where this is going on. And the Kansas City prophets are promoting the shepherding type doctrines. Okay? Meanwhile, while this is all going on, Ern Baxter is sending his New Wine magazine to everybody, which is promoting Kingdom Now Dominion theology, which comes straight from R.J. Rushdoony. Okay? And so all this stuff is going on now in the early 80s. And by 1990, this guy comes out with a report on everything that the it's called The Documentation of Aberrant Practices and Teachings in the Kansas City Fellowship, Grace Ministries. That's the Kansas City Prophets, okay? This is a Baptist pastor named Ernst Gruen who put together a 132-page report with testimonials of just abuse, of people getting ostracized out of the church, people having prophecies over them that didn't come true, people like ending up in the hospital or losing their money over this, or being ostracized to their friends, churches they've destroyed. He basically goes on and on, lists tons of false prophecies that they're doing. Like, he's like, this is a mess and people need to know about this, okay? He makes a sermon about it, and the sermon is like, I forget what he calls it, but it's like, can you not speak up or something like that. And you can find all this at Banner Ministries in the UK, which collects a lot of this. Keeping an eye on the apostasy stuff, okay? Banner.org.uk, you can find these reports, okay? And he's going to give you a number of different prophecies and stuff that are going to come from Bob Jones. Now remember, these guys are circulating with Paul Cain, who's a CIA spook, okay? Paul Cain is working with Bush, who's ex-CIA director, and Clinton, who is mentored by Carol Quigley, who's basically openly outing the New World Order stuff, okay? Bob Jones, around this time, is going to come up with a prophecy. Remember, he's got familiar spirits, and he's going to come up with a prophecy which has a friend of his named Don Stewart or something like that in it. And out of this, he's going to interpret this dream as a guy coming whose name is Don. Listen to me, a guy coming whose name is Don, who is going to be Jesus Christ manifest. Okay? Now, I don't remember what year this prophecy is, but let me see here. Mike Bickle, the Lord appears to Bob, and he leaves his body and goes, he has a visitation with the Lord, and there's a mighty angel of God, and he had Dominus written on his forehead, and Bob looked at the angel, and he says, I don't know you. And this angel says, how are you doing, Bob? Have a seat. And he says, you know what's going to happen? And the Lord says, the Lord's going to bring a reunion of angels to this city, to Kansas City. Angels that were there in the healing revival of 1948, they're going to rejoin again, and I'm going to have them in Kansas City. So apparently, Bob Jones has probably been known about this healing revival stuff, which would involve Branham or Branhamite people, okay? He says, then Bob looks up, and Dominus in his, is a little book of his with names on it, and the name Dominus means Lord or Sovereign One. It's also very Catholic. So then he goes back to bed. I mean, this is Latin, okay? So then he goes back to bed, and right there he has a trance again, and this time Jesus stands before him, and Jesus says to him, Bob, and he goes, Bob, he says, didn't you understand that that was me that stood before you a little while ago? So this is all this thing about him and this Dominus guy, right? And then he says, Bob says, the Lord tells him that Bob Scott and Mike Bickle, that Dominus, he says, I am going to visit them and I'm going to give them the same message so that you'll know that it came from me. So Bob, he's excited. He calls up and he says, Dominus, told me that he's going to visit you and he's going to come and show you the power that he showed me. And he's going to be your friend. Bob said, very careful in the next period of time, for Don will come and show you his glory, and it will be the Lord. Don will come and show you that this will be the Lord. And he says, of course, me and Bob drove home and kind of giggled. And Bob Scott tells me, he goes, I had an incredible dream last night that was from the Lord. Remember, two guys having the same dream. This is how the Seven Mountains Mandate starts, okay? And he goes, it was awesome. The only major character in this dream was a real old friend from St. Louis, and his name was Don, okay? So there's a friend from St. Louis named Don, and he says, and we go over Bob Jones. Bob says, well, did you see Don yet? And Bob goes, well, as a matter of fact, I did, but that couldn't have been Jesus. That was my good friend. And Bob goes to tell you, I told you you wouldn't recognize him. That guy couldn't have been Jesus. And then I said, well, that couldn't have been Jesus, but that couldn't have been Jesus, not that guy. And then he says, about 5 or 6 days later, I have a vision. Behold, I'm going to tell you, talking to my good friend Don, but it's Don Stedman. That's his name. This is more than a dream. It was like a trance that night. And I said, Don, the power of God is about to break forth in the midst of this people. And I was looking in the aisles, and the power of God descended mightily upon the people. And I said, man, Don, that's the power of God. That's incredible. I had a trance last night from God about healing power. And Bob Jones said, well, he's just impatient with us. He goes, you unbelievers both had a vision of your friend Don and the power of God. And I told you that this would take place. By the time I had it, me and Bob Scott repented, and we went to Bob Jones and said, man, we believe this stuff. We're in all the way. Count us in, and we're believers. So essentially, they both had a vision of this guy named Don Stedman. And basically, they say, boy, I can't imagine Don being the Lord. And now, listen to this. This was the bizarre thing we decided to believe. He said, well, you guys are trying my patience so much. The Lord said he was going to appear to you two. You're so dull. I can't take it, Lord. And I looked at Bob Scott and he said, do you think that was the Lord? And Bob Scott says, boy, we can't imagine Don being the Lord. And now listen to this. This was a bizarre thing we decided to believe. Okay, so they have their friend Don, and it's based on a vision that a guy named Don is going to be the Lord, and they both beat this guy Don. So it doesn't really clarify, like there's going to be this future guy named Don who is going to be the Lord manifest. But this is the bulk of their prophecy, and they read it based on this guy they both know named Don Stedman, who's in the prophecy, that there's a guy named Don who's going to be the Dominus, in other words, the Lord, in the flesh. Okay? Now this is circulating around these guys. Now mind you, these guys are starting this ministry, and it's all based on Bob's stories in 1983. Guess what else happens in 1983? That's taken in 1983. This talk about him being interested in peace with Israel, and talk about him, people asking him if he's ever going to run for president, this starts in 1983 at the same time the Kansas City Prophets are starting. Okay? Mind you, they're hooked up with Paul Kane, who is hooked up with the Bushes and the Clintons, and they all know him. He knows both of them, okay? Donald Trump was a Republican before he became a Democrat, before he became a Republican again, okay? And you got this guy who's, in their vision, Don, who's going to be Jesus manifest, okay? This is going around Kansas City. So I'm not going to get into all these different prophecies and stuff. You have all these prophecies, all these abuse. I would recommend you guys read this whole thing, see if there's anything in there that makes sense. But it's basically, this guy is showing how many false prophecies these guys have. And they're always talking about raising up a generation, okay? Now, Catherine Kuhlman in 1972 in Oral Roberts University is going to prophesy to a class that they're going to be the last generation before the end times. The last youth generation, okay? And that's in 1972. In 1977, the Catholics are confirming it. And by 1981, Chuck Smith is predicting the end times coming. Okay? This is how whacked out this generation is. Now, you have the Kingdom Now stuff seeping in. You have the Lordship Salvation stuff seeping in. And then you have John Wimber platforming the Kansas City Prophets and Paul Kane. Well, in 1990, that report comes out, and it leads to all these people like, get away from this shepherding movement stuff and get away from this... these Kansas City prophets. These are among the stories of abuse among people who are down with the shepherding ideas. And they don't like this whole, come under dominion, come under their authority, this Dominus stuff. And basically what they're really preaching is that when you start aligning people under all these prophets, and it's eventually going to be apostles, that eventually Christ is going to manifest and rule the whole thing like a new super pope. Okay? This is where it's coming to. And these people... essentially are going to seep into the church growth movement, okay? Now, the church growth movement starts with Donald McGavran, and he's a missiologist. He basically, I think he was a missionary in India, I believe, but he is part of the Disciples of Christ, which is going to be, think like Churches of Christ or Stone Campbell movement, okay? He is going to start a department basically in Fuller Theological Seminary, which is based around researching church growth and what's effective and what's not in the mission fields, okay? He starts this department in, let's see. He starts this department in 1961. He tries to do it in a number of colleges in Eugene, Oregon, but he eventually lands at Fuller Theological Seminary, okay, in 1965, okay? Remember, the Jesus hippity movement is going to start in the late 60s, okay? And so he starts the church growth department at Fuller Theological Seminary, and by 1971, he gives the reins of it to C. Peter Wagner, okay? C. Peter Wagner is going to, one of his first students in this department is going to be John Wimber. So John Wimber is taking church growth courses from C. Peter Wagner. He was going for a PhD in this, and then he felt like God was calling him to just focus on the vineyards and growing the vineyards. And so he just does like a year and he doesn't finish, okay? But he's pulling together music and signs and wonders, and this is becoming successful. And of course, this guy's all about studying what works and what becomes successful in church growth, and then he's going to transfer that around, okay? Well, C. Peter Wagner is also educated at Princeton Theological Seminary. And in case you guys wonder if Illuminati is confirmed at Princeton Theological Seminary, that's just what their sign looks like. This whole Eye of Providence did not come from the Illuminati. It came from the Calvinists and the Freemasons, okay? And it's going to be on the seal with the pyramid and all that stuff from like 1935, announcing the birth of a new secular age, okay? New Novus Ordo Seclorum or whatever, new order of the ages, okay? It's on the dollar and all that. It's real stuff, okay? You actually have H.G. Wells writing in the 1930s, The Open Conspiracy, where he basically describes what everything the UN's done since then, okay? H.G. Wells is like a spiritist, and he's into medium stuff. And he is coming up with everything that's in science fiction, everything that's in the comic book genre, everything that's in modern technology, and everything that's in modern New World Order stuff between the late 1800s and the 1930s. I think he dies in like the 1940s, okay? H.G. Wells is basically a demoniac false prophet, okay? So C. Peter Wagner is going to start Fuller Theological Seminary, or he's going to lead Fuller Theological Seminary's church growth group, and by I think it's like the 1980s. Let's see if I can find this stuff. It's by 1982. John Wimber, remember he's actually studying under C. Peter Wagner's church growth in 1974, and then he's going to leave and just do vineyard stuff nonstop. And in 1982, this is around the same time the Kansas City Prophets are forming, he is going to team up with C. Peter Wagner and start basically courses on signs and wonders and church growth. In other words, how to grow your church growth or through incorporating signs and wonders at Fuller. Okay. And basically, Fuller is going to become a hotbed for this, and they're going to start institutionalizing this stuff across their churches, and then they're going to be selling it. And he's going to train up something like, I want to say it's like 700 pastors. Okay? So he's going to train up a bunch of pastors who have the latest and greatest tools in how to make your church grow and be popular, which is good music, signs and wonders, and then scientific metrics and studies on what the people want and what works and what doesn't. Okay, so there's going to be a combination of stuff that probably is effective and stuff that's just, tickling the flesh. Okay, and these guys are going to start this in the 1980s. At the same time, he starts to platform Paul Cain and the Kansas City Prophets. So all this stuff is circulating together. Mind you, the shepherding movement is still going on. It's not fully outed yet. These guys don't repent of it for like another few years. And then they just change their magazine title from New Wine because everybody knows New Wine's associated with the shepherding movement, and they change the message to Christian conquest. And then it's basically the same thing as Kingdom Now theology, okay, Dominion theology. And what was the shepherding movement is going to come back as the new Apostolic Reformation, okay? So John Wimber, and he's gonna keep doing this. He's gonna be spreading the vineyard movements. The vineyards are largely train wrecks, okay? I went to vineyard churches in the 90s where they'd do mosh pits and stuff like this in church, okay? I can tell you about smoking pot with the pastor's kid at the. Like the friend who introduced me to the vineyard movement is now a married homosexual with adopted kids. Okay? That's the vineyard movement. Okay? And yes, that's one example, but there's a lot of this stuff among this because Lonnie Frisbee is going to circulate around this, and he's going to keep swinging. And basically, he's going to end up dying of AIDS in the early 1990s. Chuck Smith is going to call out John Wimber and say, how can you work with this guy when we know, like, we've got a guy in our church who admitted to having an affair with him for 6 months after he's a professing born-again Christian. And then basically Lonnie Frisbee's going to be outed from the vineyards, and he's going to get really bitter and stuff like that, and he's basically going to claim that he just went to that guy for drugs and the guy raped him. Okay, he's been never gotten off drugs, never gotten out of homosexuality since he supposedly got saved, and he's so anointed and he could do miracles all over the place. Okay, so Lonnie Frisbee is going to be associated with that. Paul Cain is going to get outed as a homosexual. He's going to get found out in the 1990s for picking up homosexual prostitutes. Okay, and then you're going to find a couple more guys who are associated with this movement. So one of the guys who Wagner is going to be very close to is Ted Haggard. Ted Haggard is going to get outed as a homosexual for buying meth from gay prostitutes. Okay, he recently, just as 2022, he's getting founded on other charges. He got founded on other charges in like 2006. He gets outed with a gay prostitute in meth, and now he's getting outed again in 2022 for two guys saying that he made moves on them in the church. He supposedly went through a rehabilitation process with his wife, aka his beard, and he's still doing it. I don't know how you could remain married to somebody who's going having sex with men. But these guys are starting the biggest churches in the world. They're booming, and they're making lots of money, and they're frauds. Okay? Another guy who is going to be associated with C. Peter Wagner is Robert Slierdon. And Robert Slierdon writes God's Generals. Okay? He's going to be outed as a homosexual in the early 2000s. He writes God's Generals in, let's see, 1996. Okay, by I think it's like 2001, he gets outed as a homosexual. 5 years later. Okay, now this is important. 1996, he writes God's Generals, which is basically a complete whitewashing of the whole history of the Charismatic Pentecostal movement. Okay. Making out to be these great heroes. He's bringing back in Maria Woodworth-Etter, John G. Lake, John Alexander Dowie, Charles Parham, Amy Semple McPherson, Catherine Kuhlman, all the who's who of these frauds. Catherine Kuhlman was married to a married man, gave false prophecies, all these frauds. He's going to whitewash all their stories and turning it into like, these are the big wigs that God's really used to change the generation and just lead millions of people to Christ and outpour the Holy Spirit and do miracles, and we all just want to be like them. Okay, this is Robert Slierdon. 5 years later, he's outed as a homosexual. Okay, he gets caught, goes through it, lays low for a while, and he's back. This is what they always do. He's back. I promise you, these guys haven't changed, because they're still doing the same stuff. They're not telling the truth. And out of this, you're going to have this idea. Remember, God's Generals. This is the shepherding movement all over again. It's the idea that there's going to be these great, larger-than-life, holier-than-thou personalities, these new apostles and prophets, that God is going to pull up and pull together and basically align the church underneath these people and unify the whole church and usher in the end times, that is now mixing with Kingdom Now, Calvinist, Dominionist theology to be post-millennial. We're going to Christianize the world for Jesus, okay? This is going to turn into the Seven Mountains Mandate by the early 2000s. I hear about the Seven Mountains Mandate by like 2008, okay? So in 1996, this is when he writes God's Generals, and this is also when he starts getting to these guys all start getting together and having roundtables about this. Okay, basically, I know some people are going to complain about how often I say basically, because I'm talking about a ton of information and it's like just a whatever. It's a transition phrase. In 1996, C. Peter Wagner starts having basically meetings with guys who are using his church growth methodology packets and basically growing their churches using vineyard shepherding. Okay, it's going to be a combination of vineyard, it's going to be a combination of shepherding, it's going to be dominion theology, it's going to be the latest and greatest music, signs and wonders emphasis, and just putting on a great show. Okay, they're getting really good at doing this and growing a church really fast. And he's going to put together a group of people in 1996. Remember, These guys supposedly repent of the shepherding movement in 1986. So this is 10 years later. These guys in 1996 are going to come up with these ideas of like God advancing. Remember, the Kansas City prophets are, they get outed in 1990 for all their abuse and stuff like that. And then John Wimber comes in and he says, I will put them under my covering and make sure it straightens up, okay? And basically just says everything they're doing is just because they're new at this, okay? Mind you, Bob Jones is he's middle-aged when they start. Mike Bickle's in his 30s and he starts, and all these other guys who, they're all 30s and 40s when they start doing this. They're not young kids, okay? But they're going to say it's just immaturity. We're going to straighten these guys out, and they basically absorb Kansas City Fellowship into a Vineyard Church. All the Kansas City prophets just start leaving and touring, and John Wimber supports all that. And then Paul Cain is basically the guy they're announcing as the main, basically the greatest prophet in the earth. Bob Jones is going to say he is the only prophet on the level of Samuel in the earth. So he's like the top prophet in the earth, and he's a CIA spook. Okay? After the Kansas City prophets get outed, they go back and become a Vineyard Church. All the Kansas City prophets are going to leave, and then Mike Bickle is going to leave and go start IHOP. Okay, they don't want to be under authority. These guys want to do their own thing, and basically it just becomes a obscure Kansas City Fellowship just becomes another Vineyard. Okay, we're not quite there yet. So immediately after they supposedly come under Vineyard Fellowship and they're straightening out, Bob Jones in 1991 gets caught trying to get two women to basically disrobe in front of him in order to be naked before the Lord in order to receive prophecies. So Bob Jones gets outed by the group publicly, but privately they still keep revering him as a legit prophet until he dies in I think it's 2004. But basically for the rest of his life, they treat him like he's a legit prophet, even though he's doing this, okay? They still treat his prophecies like they're like legit prophecies from the Lord about what the Lord's going to do in the future. Remember, the Dawn prophecy, the billion soul harvest prophecy. This is like warm up for MAGA, okay? And so the Kansas City prophets are basically going to skedaddle and spread, and they're going to circulate around all these churches because Peter Wagner is promoting signs and wonders as a way to grow your churches. And so these guys now, all these false prophets are going to start circulating around all these churches that grow, okay? And then Robert Liardon is going to write God's Generals to promote the idea of God raising up these greater-than-life people who are going to rock the world and change the church and basically unify the church and usher in the end of the age and Christ coming back, okay? In 1996, he starts this group, and he first calls it the post-denominational apostles or something like that, or the post-denominational movement, okay, in 1996. And basically what he's trying to do is he is trying to come up with exactly like the shepherding movement organizational structure for the new non-denominational charismatic thing that God is apparently doing throughout the earth, okay? And that turns into, by 1999, they come up with the name, the New Apostolic Reformation. All of the idea of the third wave, which is basically the third wave according to him, starts with the Kansas City prophets. He's saying, he's legitimizing this thing as the start of the next big Pentecostal thing God's doing. Mind you, all these guys are going to go down, and you see Mike Bickle now currently going down in sexual abuse, and they're also really going to push unity with the Pope, which starts back in the 70s. Okay, so he's going to start the New Apostolic Reformation in 2000, and I think he's going to die in 2003, 2004. Okay, but that's where he leaves things. Right after that, Robert Liardon gets outed. Ted Haggard. Oh, Robert Liardon and Ted Haggard are one of the original. I think they have 24 or 25 guys. I found the list at one point in time, and I misplaced it. I'm probably going to have to keep doing some research on this. I did find the list, but I know Ted Haggard and Robert Liardon are on that list. So I haven't researched all the guys on the New Apostles list, but C. Peter Wagner's picking them. He's picking them out of people who are adopting his church growth program, which is, again, it's going to be signs and wonders mixed with cool music, mixed with church growth tactics, okay? So that's those guys, and they're going to keep doing this. Now, meanwhile, back at the Batcave, and this is going to be another episode, Rushdoony's stuff is going to filter in through 9 Marks and the Gospel Coalition all over the Baptists and the Calvinists. And so you're having Rushdoony, he's affecting everything. And now he's coming back as theonomy, okay, which is basically Doug Wilson and Joel Webbin, and you're going to have, what's his name, James White's church is going to be into this stuff. You're going to have Jeff Durbin. Jeff Durbin's been platforming Rushdoony's son since 2016 and talking about his dad's ideas and how great they were. Okay, this is James White's church now. This is Jeff Durbin. This stuff is going to spread among the Calvinists. And so remember where this stuff is going. It's Mosaic law keeping. It's stoning people to death. It's basically post-Dominionism or post-millennialism, but it's increasingly militant sounding. Okay? They're always saying it's not. But then the language among the Charismatics is very militant sounding, but they're saying it's just spiritual. But the point is you're creating an atmosphere of talking militarily about taking over the world for Jesus. And they're saying it a lot. And meanwhile, you've got guys like Blackwater who are out of Reformed theology who are going to be literally doing this. And all these Christians are going to be supporting George Bush in the 9/11 war, which he's calling a crusade and stuff like that. And so you have this idea of like, oh man, these are really people who are trying to take over the world for Jesus with physical force, and they're eventually going to stone us to death. All the ideas are in it. So it's creating this ethos that is basically going, the left is going to be able to point at it and be like, these people are freaking crazy. We need to subdue them or get rid of them. Okay? That's about all I can cover because this is mostly the NAR and where that has its roots back to Rushdoony. But again, you're going to have C. Peter Wagner, who's a Princeton educated, which means Presbyterian, basically charismatic, and then you're going to have Ern Baxter, who's a Presbyterian charismatic. Who those two guys are the main guys who are over shepherding and the NAR, and they're two of the same thing, and it's just mixing Calvinist dominion and control freak stuff with charismatic signs and wonders and BS spiritual authority. It's the exact same thing, and these guys are all connected to Rushdoony. I think C. Peter Wagner was into Rushdoony too. I'll have to do a little bit more research on that before I affirm that positively, but it's looking like it's going in that direction. So what I want you guys to have the takeaway of this is the New Apostolic Reformation is the shepherding movement. The shepherding movement basically went underground with Ern Baxter and Rushdoony and those guys and comes back as the New Apostles Reformation through Rick Joyner, Kansas City Prophets, and C. Peter Wagner. It is the shepherding movement. It's the exact same thing. You have the same tithing up. You have the same guys who are supposedly in spiritual authority over you, and that's self-appointed, and then it trickles down to all the people around them. It's just a bigger version of the shepherding movement. So everybody should be calling this out. The fact that Michael Brown is basically saying there is no New Apostolic Reformation, he's lying to you. This is an official group that came out. And part of their ideology is like, even if, look at this stuff is going to spread into the televangelists too. And this is going to be like, what is his name? Creflo Dollar is going to have a bunch of people come to their church when they find out that their pastor was dealing with homosexual prostitutes, and he basically had an entourage of gay prostitutes that he was running around the church's money to private jets and shopping sprees and stuff like this. And Creflo Dollar, these people are going to leave their church and come to Creflo Dollar's church, and Creflo Dollar is going to order them to go back under their pastor. This is how bad this is. Our pastor's a fraud and a homosexual and using our money to basically trick out his homosexual hoes. And you're saying that's still your pastor? He just had a ret go back under him. This is going to be in like the early to mid 2000s. Okay. Eddie Long is the guy. Eddie Long, new whatever Missionary Baptist Church. He died in 2017. I mean, I don't want to like rejoice in anybody's death, but thank God a lot of these people are dying. But their ideas need to die too. Okay? Like his sexual abuse allegations are going to be in... So by 2005, he's making $3 million a year in compensation and benefits. And then by 2010, he's going to have a handful of guys who are filing lawsuits that he coerced them into sexual relationship with them and were buying them all this stuff. Okay? And literally, because of the shepherding movement, you're going to have Creflo Dollar say, that's still your pastor. Go back under him. Get out of my church and go back to your pastor. That's how these evil people think. Okay? It is Roman Catholicism all over again. And that's why you have among the Charismatics now. I was in a meeting where you had like an ex-gay man and ex-gay woman were talking about how we need to talk about sexuality stuff in the church more so people are more open and free and talking about their sexual struggles and stuff like this. And then they're promoting what is a woman guy? This guy, and this is a primarily charismatic meeting, and I asked them. I said, this guy supports the organization, which is the biggest institution of closet homosexuality and pedophilia the world has ever known, hands down. Period. So why is he our spokesperson for the whole transgender stuff when the worst of sexual deviancy and cover up is in the Roman Catholic Church and he's a part of that? And all these people just got up in arms about, they're our Catholic brothers and sisters in Christ too, and there is just as much of those kind of problems in the Protestant churches as well. Well, what they mean is there's just as much of those kind of Protestants in the churches that are affected by this charismatic Catholic shepherding stuff, which is basically spiritualized Catholicism. That's all it is. And the Presbyterians are for it because the Presbyterians think they're the real Catholic Church. They're fine with spiritualized Catholicism as long as it's Presbyterian at the local level and as long as it's Calvinist in its theology. They're fine with the unified Catholic Church. And so they like the power structure of hierarchy. They just don't like the Catholics' core doctrines at the top of it, and they don't like the idea of this unified pope and singular bishops. But again, these guys are all post-millennial dominionists, and so they like the idea of organizing and getting more powerful as a structure and an organization where you can treat with a government as a unit because you control all these people and they're voting and they're thinking. They like this these ideas of boss politics, okay? It was all over the colonial ages and afterward. These bosses who would come in, and if you had the boss, you had the votes of all these people who were somehow subservient to the boss, okay? They love this stuff. It's all politics. It always was politics. So again, NAR is the shepherding movement. It's Rushdoony. It's Calvinist Dominionism mixed with charismania. That's all it is. And it's not like kind of like that. It's not like kind of influenced by. It's directly influenced by. And when I get to the reason I got to this Molly Worthen's paper is because she talks to Wagner, and Wagner admits that they seeded this stuff among the charismatics, and that was their plan. They're seeding these ideas on purpose because they want to advance towards dominionism. And that is manifesting in the current age. And I will get to all the details in the Gospel Coalition and all this stuff eventually because it's all going in my book. It's going to manifest in the Trump worship that's coming out right now. It's all libertarian, don't tread on me, pro big business, pro-Trump, pro-deregulation, and mixed with ideas of a Don who's going to be Jesus manifest. Wait for it. It's going to be the downfall of America. We are heading towards a Nazi Germany in America. I promise you guys, it's either going to be that or it's going to be like a legitimate, big enough threat of that huge persecution starts happening on the church in order to keep that from happening. One of those two things is going to happen, or both. Okay? So you guys, that's a lot of information to process. Again, I'm still researching. I'm still writing. I'll probably come up with shorter, more succinct versions of this once I get my research done and my book done. It's a lot, you guys. I am 50 to 100 tabs open just going through tons of stuff and putting this stuff in order of who came first and who affected who. It's a lot of work, but it's starting to become clear. Rushdoony, look for Rushdoony in everything. Look for his ideology and everything, because his ideology seems to have influence in the Messianic movement, in the Charismatic movement, and in the Calvinist movement, which has largely been taking over Baptist institutes. You guys have a great rest of your weekend. Batman out. Peace.